Dad opened the door. On a freezing Christmas Eve, my teeth chattered as the blizzard howled around me. I stood on my estranged father's porch, clutching my soaking wet 1-year-old daughter to my chest. He brought his mistress into our living room, I whispered, my voice breaking. His mother packed my clothes in garbage bags, threw us out into the snow, and changed the locks. My father looked at his shivering granddaughter. He did not yell or panic. He simply tightened his grip on a heavy ring of keys and looked me dead in the eye. They picked the wrong family. My name is Naomi, and I am 32 years old. Until that freezing night, I thought I was just a forensic tax auditor married to the city's most beloved junior pastor. I had no idea my quiet auto mechanic father was actually a commercial real estate titan, or that my toxic in-laws were about to lose their entire respectable empire. Before I tell you how a freezing night turned into the ultimate revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with a family obsessed with maintaining a fake image at your expense. Growing up, my father Elias ran a local auto repair shop. It was honest work, but in the eyes of my mother-in-law, First Lady Beatrice, grease on a man's hands meant he was beneath her. She never let me forget it. For 5 years of marriage to her son Marcus, I endured the subtle jabs, the backhanded compliments, and the constant reminders that I did not come from a prominent church family. I kept my head down, raised our daughter Zuri, and secretly audited corporate frauds for a living. Marcus was preparing for a city council run, and respectability was the only currency his family cared about. I thought I was playing my part perfectly, until the blizzard hit on Christmas Eve. I had just finished putting Zuri to sleep when I walked downstairs to find a scene that made the blood freeze in my veins. My husband Marcus stood in our foyer wrapping his expensive cashmere coat around Chloe, the church's lead choir director. She was giggling, pressing her face into his neck. I froze on the bottom step, my hand gripping the banister. "Marcus, what is going on?" I demanded. Before Marcus could even formulate a lie, the front door swung open. First Lady Beatrice marched inside her designer boots, tracking snow onto my hardwood floor. She was not alone. Behind her stood Eleanor, my white sister-in-law, who was married to Marcus' older brother David. Eleanor always played the sweet, concerned savior, but her eyes practically danced with cruel excitement. Beatrice did not even look at me. She hauled 2 heavy black trash bags over the threshold and dropped them right at my feet. "Marcus is going to City Hall," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged foyer. "He needs a respectable woman from a good church family by his side, not a ghetto accountant whose daddy changes oil for a living. The divorce papers are in the trash bag." I stared at the black plastic, disbelief choking the air from my lungs. "You are throwing me out of my own house on Christmas Eve?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage, not fear. Marcus refused to meet my gaze. He kept his arm around Chloe. "It is for the best, Naomi," he muttered. "The congregation already loves Chloe. She fits the image we need for the campaign. You never really fit in with us anyway." I moved toward him, but Beatrice stepped in my path, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my face. "Grab your bastard child and get off my son's property before I have you arrested for trespassing." My own house. The mortgage I paid with my forensic accounting salary while Marcus played politician on church donations. I turned and ran upstairs, grabbing Zuri from her crib. I wrapped her in the thickest blanket I could find, ignoring her sleepy protests. When I came back down, the front door was wide open, letting the biting winter wind howl through the house. Beatrice kicked my trash bags out onto the snow-covered porch. "Get out," she ordered. I stepped out into the freezing night, clutching Zuri tightly against my chest. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me and the deadbolt clicked into place. The temperature was dropping rapidly and the snow was already ankle-deep. Suddenly, the window above the porch slid open. It was Eleanor, leaning out with a sympathetic pout plastered across her face. "Oh, honey," she called out, holding a large pitcher in her hand. "You really should call an Uber before the neighbors call the police on you for loitering. We do not want your daughter growing up with a jailed mother." Before I could respond, Eleanor tilted her wrist. A freezing cascade of ice water rained down, splashing against the porch steps and splattering onto my boots and the edges of Zuri's blanket. Eleanor offered a mock sigh, closed the window, and drew the curtains. I did not scream. I did not bang on the door begging them to let me back in. I pulled Zura's blanket tighter around her small shivering body, grabbed the 2 trash bags and started walking. I did not have my purse. I did not have my car keys. They had taken everything to humiliate me. The wind whipped against my face, cutting like glass as I trudged through the unplowed streets. 2 miles. That was the distance to my father's auto shop. Every step was agonizing, but the anger burning in my chest kept me moving. I thought about Beatrice and her obsession with respectability politics. I thought about Marcus parading his mistress in front of me, pretending to be a man of faith. I thought about Eleanor weaponizing her privilege to humiliate me while playing the innocent bystander. My boots crunched through the deep snow. Zuri whimpered against my collarbone, and I hummed softly to keep her calm. By the time I saw the faded neon sign of Elias Auto Repair, my legs were numb. The shop was dark, but a single light glowed in the small apartment above the garage. I pounded on the metal side door, my knuckles raw and bleeding from the cold. Dad opened the door. I cried out, my voice hoarse. Heavy footsteps sounded from inside. The metal door groaned open, revealing my father. Elias stood there in his worn coveralls, a wrench still in his hand. He had not spoken to me in 4 years, not since the day he warned me that Marcus and his family were nothing but well-dressed hypocrites. He had begged me not to marry into their toxic world. I had foolishly chosen love over his warning. But seeing me now, covered in snow, shivering uncontrollably with his granddaughter in my arms, his stern expression melted instantly. He dropped the wrench and pulled us into the warm garage, wrapping his thick work jacket around Zuri. He brought his mistress into our living room, I whispered, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. His mother packed my clothes in garbage bags, threw us out into the snow, and changed the locks. My father did not ask questions. He did not say, I told you so. He carefully took Zuri from my arms, holding her close to the portable heater. He looked at the 2 cheap trash bags holding my entire life. Then he walked over to an old metal filing cabinet in the corner of the garage. He unlocked it and pulled out a heavy steel ring loaded with keys. He turned back to me, his eyes dark and absolute. He did not look like an old, tired mechanic anymore. He looked like a man who held the entire city in the palm of his hands. They picked the wrong family. He set his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Let them have their silent night, Naomi. Because tomorrow morning, we are taking everything they own. The morning sun cast a blinding glare over the snow-covered city, but inside the private viewing room of downtown's most exclusive jeweler, the lighting was perfectly calibrated to make diamonds sparkle. Marcus sat on a velvet sofa sipping complimentary espresso. He was selecting a welcome home gift for Chloe. Not just any gift, but a $60,000 diamond tennis necklace. He wanted something that screamed success and stability. Something Chloe could wear to his upcoming city council campaign fundraisers to project the image of a perfect devoted partner. He handed his heavy metal credit card to the sales associate with a practiced, charismatic smile. The associate, a woman trained to cater to the city's elite, took the card with a polite nod and swiped it through the terminal. A sharp beep echoed in the quiet room. The associate's smile faltered slightly as she looked at the screen. She tried the chip reader. Another sharp beep. She discreetly cleared her throat and handed the card back. Sir, the institution is declining the transaction. Perhaps there is a daily limit you need to authorize. Marcus let out an annoyed breath, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a different card tied to our joint savings account. The machine rejected that one too. By the time he tried a third card linked directly to his pastoral discretionary fund, the associate's polite smile had vanished completely. The terminal flashed a glaring red message indicating the accounts were completely frozen. Marcus snatched his cards back, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He stormed out of the boutique, ignoring the associate's farewell. He practically punched the numbers into his phone as he stood on the icy sidewalk. I was sitting at a battered metal desk in my father's garage, watching Zuri sleep peacefully on a makeshift bed of clean, moving blankets. My laptop was open in front of me, displaying lines of banking codes and wire transfers. When my phone screen lit up with Marcus' name, I did not feel the usual anxiety that used to grip my chest whenever he was angry. I felt nothing but absolute focus. I accepted the call and put it on speaker, setting the phone down next to my keyboard. "You ungrateful witch!" His voice exploded through the tiny speaker, loud enough to make my father look up from the engine he was inspecting. "What did you do to my accounts?" I kept my eyes on the screen, tracking a series of offshore transfers. "Merry Christmas to you too, Marcus." "Do not play games with me, Naomi," he yelled, the sound of city traffic roaring in the background. "I am trying to make a simple purchase, and every single piece of plastic in my wallet is locked." "You called the fraud department, did you not? You threw a pathetic childish tantrum because things did not go your way last night. I took you out of that grease-stained auto shop. I elevated you. I gave you a respectable life, a prominent name, a house in the right zip code, and this is how you repay me. You freeze my cards like some bitter, petty ex-wife. Unfreeze them right now before I call my lawyers and leave you with absolutely nothing." He was breathing heavily, his narcissistic rage blinding him to the reality of his situation. He honestly believed that leaving his wife and infant daughter to freeze to death in a blizzard was perfectly acceptable, but having his credit cards declined was a massive injustice. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the metal desk. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the hysteria he was hoping to provoke. "You seem to forget what I do for a living, Marcus. I am a forensic tax auditor. I do not just balance checkbooks, I hunt down hidden money for the federal government. Did you really think I would just freeze the joint accounts and cry myself to sleep?" There was a slight pause on the line. The bluster in his voice dropped a fraction, replaced by a sliver of hesitation. "What are you talking about, Naomi? Unlock the account so I can finish my business." I tapped a single key on my laptop, bringing up a detailed ledger I had compiled overnight. "I did not just freeze our personal money, Marcus. I triggered an automatic security lockdown on your entire financial portfolio. You see, when a joint account holder reports suspicious activity, the bank investigates. And when they investigate, they follow the routing numbers. They follow the money you transferred from our joint savings into a shell LLC registered under Chloe's name. But that is not even the interesting part. I heard the sound of a car door slamming. He must have gotten into his vehicle. "Unfreeze the money, Naomi," he demanded again, but his voice was shaking now. I continued speaking right over him, my tone as clinical as a surgeon holding a scalpel. "The interesting part is the $150,000 you routed through that same shell company last month. The money that was supposed to go to the church's orphanage expansion fund. I traced the wire transfers, Marcus. You embezzled donations from your own congregation to pay for your city council campaign consultants and to lease a luxury condo for Chloe. I flagged every single unauthorized transaction and forwarded the ledger directly to the bank fraud division." "Naomi, you listen to me," he sputtered, his breathing ragged and shallow. "You are going to call the bank right now and tell them it was a mistake. You are going to tell them you authorized those transfers." I leaned closer to the microphone. "Enjoy explaining federal wire fraud to your campaign manager, Marcus. I am sure the voters will love hearing how the respectable junior pastor steals from orphans to finance his mistress's jewelry collection." Marcus let out a sound that was half scream, half groan. He was hyperventilating the reality of his political and professional ruin crashing down on him all at once. He started begging, pleading with me to consider his reputation, to think about how this would look for the family. But before he could formulate a coherent bargain, the sound of a scuffle came through the phone. Someone else was in the car with him. "Give me the phone," a sharp voice demanded. A second later, Eleanor, my pristine white sister-in-law, was on the line. Her voice was dripping with venom, completely stripped of the fake sweet tone she used at Sunday service. "Listen to me very carefully, you ghetto trash," she hissed. "You think you are clever playing with numbers. You think you can destroy this family. My father knows every judge in this county. By tomorrow morning, I am going to have you served with a defamation suit that will tie you up in court for the rest of your miserable life. I will tell the judge you had a mental breakdown. I will make sure Marcus gets full emergency custody of Zuri, and you will never see your child again. You picked a fight with the wrong people, Naomi. "Fix the accounts or we will bury you." The line went dead. I stared at the dark screen of my phone. My father walked over, wiping motor oil from his hands with a rag. He looked at the phone and then at me, waiting for my reaction. I did not flinch. I just reached for my keyboard and prepared my next move. I spent the next 6 hours submerged in digital ledgers, banking codes, and offshore corporate registries. The sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light through the frosted windows of my father's garage. Zuri was awake now, babbling happily in her makeshift bed, completely unaware of the financial war I was waging on the very people who had thrown us out into a blizzard. I handed her a bottle of warm milk, just as the jarring wail of police sirens shattered the quiet morning. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the greasy concrete floor, cutting through the shadows of the shop. I stood up, my muscles stiff from sitting in a metal folding chair all night. Before my father could even hit the button to roll up the main garage door, 2 police cruisers skidded to a halt, blocking the driveway. Out stepped Eleanor, draped in a pristine white wool coat that probably cost more than my first year of college tuition. Next to her was David, Marcus' older brother, walking with that familiar, arrogant strut the men in their family had perfected. They were flanked by 2 broad-shouldered police officers, whose hands were already resting aggressively near their utility belts. I stepped out of the side door of the garage, the freezing morning air hitting my face. Eleanor immediately shrank behind the taller of the 2 officers, pressing a gloved hand to her mouth. She let out a dramatic, trembling sob, squeezing her eyes shut to force a stream of tears down her perfectly powdered cheeks. "There she is," Officer Eleanor cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That is the unstable woman I told you about. She abandoned her home last night in a complete mental episode, and now she refuses to return the church's vehicle. We just want to get her help, but she is completely out of her mind." I looked past Eleanor to my black Mercedes SUV parked perfectly near the gas pumps. I had dropped it off at my father's shop earlier that week for winter tires. David and Eleanor must have tracked the vehicle's GPS, assuming I had stolen it when I fled their house. David puffed out his chest, looking at the cops with the practiced authority of a wealthy donor who believed the law existed only to serve him. "Officer, that vehicle belongs to the Oasis megachurch ministry." David lied smoothly, his voice dripping with fake concern. "My sister-in-law here has been having a severe psychological breakdown for weeks. We are incredibly worried about the safety of my baby niece, but right now, we just need the church property returned before she damages it or hurts someone." She stole the keys and fled. The older cop took a heavy step toward me, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound was deafening in the cold air. "Ma'am, I need you to place your hands behind your back," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We have a report of grand theft auto and child endangerment. We can sort this out down at the precinct, but right now you are coming with us." I did not back away. I stared dead at Eleanor, watching her peek out from behind the officer. She was using the exact playbook her family always relied on, weaponizing her privilege and the authorities to silence anyone who dared to challenge their pristine image. A single mother accused of theft and instability, facing 2 armed officers. It was a calculated, lethal trap designed to terrify me into submission. But before the officer could close the distance, my father stepped out from the shadows of the garage bay. He did not rush. He walked with a slow, deliberate, heavy stride that commanded the entire driveway. He was holding a grease-stained rag, casually wiping dark motor oil from his massive hands. "Hold on a minute, gentlemen," my father said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that echoed off the brick walls. "Nobody is putting cuffs on my daughter." David scoffed, taking a step forward. "Stay out of this, Elias. This is church business. Your daughter committed a felony and we are simply retrieving stolen property. Give the officers the keys right now and maybe we will ask the district attorney to show her some leniency in court." My father tossed the greasy rag onto a nearby metal workbench. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coveralls and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. He walked right past David, completely ignoring him, and slammed the folders onto the freezing metal hood of the police cruiser. The sharp smack made Eleanor jump and drop her fake sobbing routine. Officer, my father said, tapping the top document with a heavily calloused finger. I highly suggest you read the DMV title before you make a false arrest and end up on the wrong side of a massive civil rights lawsuit. That Mercedes SUV does not belong to any church. It belongs to Oasis Holdings, LLC. I am the sole proprietor of Oasis Holdings. I bought that car for my daughter 3 years ago using my own corporate funds. The older cop frowned, hesitating before he picked up the document. He scanned the official state seal, the vehicle identification number, and the listed owner. The paperwork was absolutely flawless. The cop looked at David, his expression shifting instantly from compliant to highly suspicious. Sir, this title clearly states the vehicle belongs to this man's corporation. There is no church listed anywhere on this document. David turned a sickly shade of pale. That is impossible. We have the tax write-offs at the church office. I registered it under the ministry myself to save on the dealership fees. You certainly tried to. My father rumbled, crossing his massive arms over his chest. But my daughter here is a forensic tax auditor. She caught you forging the church's tax-exempt ID number to avoid paying the state sales tax on a vehicle you did not even pay for. She quietly fixed the paperwork at the state level to protect herself from your sheer stupidity. My father took one step closer to the police officers towering over them. So, gentlemen, you have a very simple choice to make this morning. You can try to arrest my daughter for driving a car that her own father legally provided for her. Or you can arrest David right now for attempting federal tax fraud and filing a false police report. Which paperwork would you like to process today? The two officers looked at each other and then glared back at David. The handcuffs disappeared instantly back into the utility belt. Eleanor stopped crying completely, her mouth hanging open in silent terror. Her fragile white savior performance entirely collapsed under the crushing weight of hard, undeniable evidence. The officers took a collective step away from David, looking at him as if he had suddenly become a massive liability. David was trembling, his arrogant posture entirely gone, as he realized he had just confessed to tax fraud in front of two sworn police officers. He grabbed Eleanor's arm desperately, pulling her toward their luxury sedan. As they scrambled to retreat, my father leaned in close to David. He dropped his voice to a chilling, razor-sharp whisper that carried perfectly through the crisp winter air. Tell your mother her mortgage is next. David and Eleanor scrambled into their sedan and sped away, leaving fresh tire tracks in the deep snow. My father gave me a firm, approving nod, and we walked back into the warmth of the garage. I barely had time to brush the snowflakes off my jacket before my phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. And again. A relentless, violent vibration that signaled something had gone terribly wrong. I pulled it from my pocket and stared at the illuminated screen. I had 47 new notifications in the span of 3 minutes. The top one was a direct link sent by a former friend from the church choir. It directed me to the Oasis Megachurch official Facebook page. First Lady Beatrice was broadcasting live to thousands of congregation members. I tapped the screen, and her face filled my phone. Beatrice sat in her pristine living room wearing a modest pearl-buttoned cardigan, clutching a white tissue. Her makeup was perfectly done, but her eyes were artfully red and puffy. My heart is incredibly heavy today, church family, she said, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical emotion. I come to you this morning to ask for your prayers. Last night, my daughter-in-law Naomi suffered a severe mental breakdown. She abandoned her loving husband and fled into the freezing night with our precious granddaughter. My blood ran cold as I watched her lie to thousands of viewers. The sheer audacity of her performance was sickening. Marcus is devastated, Beatrice continued, dabbing at a completely dry eye. But he is stepping up as the godly man he is. This morning, he is filing for emergency sole custody to protect little Zuri. We are praying Naomi gets the psychiatric help she desperately needs, but our first duty is to the safety of that innocent child. Please pray for my son as he navigates this dark season. She ended the stream with a dramatic prayer for my troubled soul. The comments underneath the video were a tidal wave of absolute vitriol. The same women who used to smile and compliment my baked goods at Sunday service were now calling me a Jezebel. They said I was demonically oppressed. Some suggested I was on drugs. Others said I never deserved a prominent man of God like Marcus. My phone immediately started ringing with blocked numbers. I answered one just to hear the venom firsthand. A woman from the prayer committee told me I was going to burn in hell for tearing a holy family apart and that I deserved to have my baby taken away by the state. Another message threatened to call the police if I ever showed my face near the church sanctuary again. They were trying to break me. Beatrice knew exactly what she was doing. She was using the congregation as a loyal army to isolate me, terrify me, and paint me as an unstable, dangerous mother. It was the perfect setup. Marcus needed a pristine family image for his city council campaign posters. If he had to steal my daughter and commit me to an asylum to maintain that facade, his mother was more than happy to lay the public groundwork. I did not panic. I did not post a crying video in response. I did not take to Facebook Live to defend my honor or plead with the congregation to believe my side of the story. Women like Beatrice thrive on emotional reactions. They want you hysterical so they can point a manicured finger and say, "Look how crazy she is." I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I walked over to the battered metal desk in the corner of my father's shop and opened my laptop. I am a forensic tax auditor. I do not fight with tears. I fight with receipts. I accessed my secure terminal and pulled up the financial records for Oasis Megachurch. I bypassed Marcus and Beatrice entirely. If you want to kill a poisonous weed, you do not trim the leaves, you rip out the roots. The absolute root of Marcus' political campaign and the church's extravagant spending was their primary donor, Arthur Sterling. He was a local commercial real estate developer, a multimillionaire, and conveniently he was also the father of Marcus' mistress Chloe. Arthur had been funneling massive untaxed donations into the church, which Marcus then illegally routed into his city council campaign fund. It was a classic money laundering scheme disguised as religious tithing. Arthur thought he was completely untouchable because he hid behind the church's federal tax-exempt status. He was dead wrong. I opened the official portal for the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office. I had spent the last 6 months secretly compiling a heavily encrypted dossier on Arthur Sterling's offshore accounts and his fraudulent charitable deductions. I attached the bank routing numbers, the shell company records, and the forged tax documents. I double-checked the routing protocols, ensuring the evidence was irrefutable. With 3 firm keystrokes, I legally triggered an automatic Level 4 forensic IRS audit on Arthur Sterling's entire financial empire. I submitted the extensive file under the anonymous whistleblower protocol. Within 48 hours, federal agents would be knocking on his mansion door and freezing his corporate assets. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. The silence in the garage was broken only by the hum of the portable heater and the soft sound of Zuri breathing in her sleep. My father handed me a mug of black coffee, his eyes gleaming with silent pride. My phone sat quietly on the desk for exactly 20 minutes before the screen lit up with an urgent text message. It was not from an angry church member. It was from Marcus. The preview text read, "Arthur just called me screaming. What did you do?" I ignored it and took a sip of my coffee. 10 seconds later, he called. I let it ring. He texted again in rapid succession. "Arthur is threatening to pull all funding from the campaign and go to the press if I do not fix the Naomi problem. Answer the phone right now. He is going to ruin my entire life." I picked up the device, typed a simple response, and hit send. "Fix me, Marcus. I dare you." Less than 48 hours after I sent that text, the legal ambush began. Marcus was not about to let his carefully curated political and religious empire crumble without a vicious fight. He knew the IRS audit was looming, and he knew his mistress was furious, but his mother, Beatrice, had clearly convinced him that the best defense was a devastating offense. I walked into the sterile mahogany-paneled conference room of the county family court to find Marcus sitting at the long table. He was wearing his most conservative navy blue suit, the one he saved for Sunday sermons and press conferences. He was flanked by 2 highly paid, aggressive-looking attorneys. Beatrice sat directly behind him, clutching her pearl necklace and glaring at me with unmasked hatred. They had filed an ex parte emergency custody order. Marcus was petitioning the court to strip me of my parental rights immediately and grant him full physical and legal custody of Zuri. His lead attorney, a slick man with a patronizing smile, stood up and addressed the court mediator. "We are dealing with a severe crisis of maternal instability," the lawyer announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "My client is a respected public figure and a devoted father who is terrified for his daughter's safety. 2 nights ago, his wife suffered a severe mental break, abandoned her marital home, and dragged a helpless infant into an active industrial auto repair shop." The lawyer reached into his leather briefcase and dramatically slapped a series of glossy 8x10 photographs onto the table. They were pictures of my father's garage taken from the street. They showed the faded neon sign, the cracked asphalt, the oil stains near the service bays, and a stack of rusted spare parts. "This is an active hazardous work zone," the lawyer continued, sliding the photos toward the mediator. "There are toxic chemicals, heavy machinery, and dangerous tools everywhere. It is completely unfit for human habitation, let alone for a 1-year-old baby. We are respectfully demanding that the child be returned to her father immediately before a tragedy occurs." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with a practiced expression of deep heartbreak. "Naomi, please," he whispered, his voice cracking perfectly on cue. "Stop doing this. Just give Zuri back to me and get the psychiatric help you need. We can get you a bed at a private facility today. Just stop this madness." I did not cry. I did not defend my sanity. I simply turned my head and looked at the woman sitting calmly beside me. My father had not just sent me to court with his blessing. He had sent me with Diane Chen, one of the most ruthless and expensive family law attorneys on the East Coast. Diane did not even glance at the glossy photographs of the garage. She calmly adjusted her glasses and offered Marcus a cold, predatory smile. "That is a fascinating narrative, Counselor," Diane said, her voice perfectly even. "But it relies entirely on a complete fabrication of my client's living conditions." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents. "You claim the environment is a hazard," Diane continued. "Let us review the actual zoning laws and property blueprints. The auto shop you so diligently photographed is merely the commercial ground floor of the building. It operates strictly during business hours and is entirely sealed off from the residential sector." I took over the conversation, sliding the first set of architectural blueprints across the mahogany table. "My father, Elias, is not just a mechanic, Marcus," I stated, my voice cutting through his smug facade. "He is a commercial real estate developer who owns the entire city block. The top 3 floors above that garage consist of a custom-built $3 million luxury penthouse fortress. It is equipped with dedicated state-of-the-art climate control, a private secure elevator, and hospital-grade air filtration systems." I pushed the supporting documents forward. "You can verify the property deeds and the residential zoning approvals in the submitted file Duyen Mao 1_11.docx, which clearly establishes the legal separation of the commercial and residential spaces. If you require further proof of the pristine living conditions, the architectural safety certifications, and environmental testing results are fully detailed in Duyen Mao 2_11.docx. Marcus stared at the blueprints, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes wide with shock. They had spent years mocking my father for having grease on his hands, completely unaware that he could buy and sell their entire church ministry 10 times over. The realization that they had wildly underestimated my family hit Marcus like a physical blow. The slick lawyer beside him suddenly looked incredibly nervous, shuffling through the documents and realizing his entire emergency petition was based on a totally false premise. But I was not finished. The legal ping-pong had just begun, and it was time for my final strike. "If we are going to sit in this room and talk about child safety," I said, keeping my posture completely relaxed, "let us talk about the real danger here. Let us talk about your fitness as a parent, Marcus." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single manila folder, I set it on the table, keeping my hand firmly over the cover. 2 months ago, you were rushed to the emergency room in the middle of the night. I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Your mother sent out an urgent prayer request to the entire congregation, claiming you were suffering from severe campaign exhaustion and spiritual warfare. You spent 3 days in a private recovery wing. Marcus went completely rigid. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His lawyer frowned, sensing the sudden shift in his client's demeanor. Where is this going? The lawyer demanded. I slid the manila folder across the table directly in front of the mediator. It is going to the truth, I replied. I used my federal clearance to quietly pull the actual hospital records. They are heavily redacted for privacy, but the essential data is undeniable. The toxicology screen marked internally as Duyen Mao 3_11.docx, and the attending physician's admission notes, referenced as Duyen Mao 4_11.docx, tell a very different story about that night. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my soon-to-be ex-husband. There was no campaign exhaustion, Marcus. You suffered a massive cardiac event induced by a lethal overdose of unauthorized synthetic amphetamines. You had a heart attack because you were doing illegal narcotics in a hotel room with your mistress. The silence in the room was absolute. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she might faint. The slick lawyer snatched the medical folder, opening it with trembling hands and reading the undeniable chemical analysis. His face fell, recognizing instantly that his client had lied to him and that their entire custody case had just imploded. Marcus was cornered. His breathing grew shallow and rapid, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. If you do not withdraw this emergency custody petition right this exact second, I said, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a final sentence, I will submit this medical file into the public court record. I will make sure every single voter in this city and every single member of your congregation knows exactly what kind of drugs the respectable junior pastor uses to cope with spiritual warfare. Withdraw the petition, Marcus. Now. The slick lawyer did not hesitate. He aggressively shoved the glossy photographs of my father's garage back into his leather briefcase and slammed it shut. He looked at Marcus with absolute disgust. The emergency custody petition is withdrawn, he announced to the court mediator, his voice entirely stripped of its previous arrogance. We will revisit standard custody arrangements at a later date. He stood up and marched out of the conference room without waiting for his client. Marcus remained frozen in his chair, his eyes glued to the medical folder containing his darkest secret. Beatrice sat behind him, clutching her chest, taking shallow, ragged breaths. Diane Chen. My attorney calmly gathered our documents and gave me a sharp nod of approval. The ambush was over. I had won the first battle, but the war was far from finished. I excused myself and walked down the echoing marble hallway of the courthouse. My adrenaline was crashing, leaving my hands slightly shaky. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the women's restroom, seeking 2 minutes of silence to splash cold water on my face and breathe. The bathroom was empty. The bright fluorescent lights hummed above the pristine white sinks. I turned on the cold tap and cupped the water in my hands, pressing it against my flushed cheeks. I took a deep breath, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I was no longer the terrified woman standing in the blizzard. I was a mother fighting for her child's life. The heavy wooden door clicked shut and the deadbolt locked. I turned to see Eleanor standing blocking the exit. She had abandoned the frantic panic she displayed at my father's auto shop. She was back in her element, wearing a tailored beige skirt suit. Her blonde hair perfectly smoothed, her posture reeking of practiced entitlement. She took a slow step toward me, pulling a pristine white envelope from her designer handbag. Naomi, she began, her voice adopting a sickeningly sweet, syrupy tone. This entire situation has gotten completely out of hand. We are both women. We are both mothers. We both know how ugly and traumatizing a public court battle can be for a child. I crossed my arms over my chest, ignoring her fake empathy. Get out of my way, Eleanor. She took another step closer, holding the envelope out to me. Beatrice and I want to help you, she said, her eyes wide with manufactured sympathy. We know you are struggling financially. We know you do not belong in a grease-stained garage. Marcus is willing to be generous. Inside this envelope is a certified cashier's check for $50,000. It is yours right now, clear and free. I stared at the white envelope. $50,000 to sell my daughter to a family of hypocrites and frauds. All you have to do is walk away. Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Take the money, Naomi. Start a new life. Open your own little accounting firm in a different city. Let Marcus have primary custody of Zuri. It is the best thing for her, and you know it. You do not want to drag this out. Be reasonable, Naomi. Your kind of people do not win against ours. There it was. The ugly, racist truth hiding just beneath their respectable church-going facade. She actually believed her wealth, her zip code, and the color of her skin made her untouchable. She actually believed I was just some desperate poor woman who could be bought off with a single check. I reached out and took the envelope from her manicured hand. Eleanor offered a smug, victorious smile, assuming I had folded under the weight of her superiority. I opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp, certified check. It was real. $50,000 made out to my name. I held it up to the fluorescent light, inspecting the bank logo and the authorized signature. Then I grabbed the check with both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. Eleanor's smug smile vanished instantly. She let out a sharp gasp. "What are you doing?" I put the torn halves together and ripped them again. Then I dropped the pieces onto the wet porcelain sink. "My kind of people," I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You mean the people who actually check the routing numbers?" Eleanor took a step back, her back hitting the bathroom door. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "You really should have paid more attention when Marcus told you what I do for a living," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I am a forensic tax auditor. I track hidden money. And while I was auditing Marcus and Arthur Sterling last night, I found a very interesting series of recurring wire transfers. They were coming from the church's general offering fund and going directly into a registered nonprofit called Women in Ministry." All the color drained from Eleanor's face. Her hands began to shake, clutching her expensive handbag. I pulled the corporate filings for Women in Ministry. I continued, trapping her against the door. "You are listed as the sole director, Eleanor. It claims to provide scholarships for disadvantaged young girls. But strange thing about your charity, I could not find a single scholarship ever awarded. I did, however, find massive expenditures at luxury day spas, exclusive country clubs, and high-end designer boutiques. You are running a fraudulent slush fund, stealing tithes from working-class families to finance your luxury lifestyle." She shook her head wildly, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "You cannot prove that. You are crazy." I leaned in close enough to smell her expensive perfume. "I can prove every single cent. The paper trail is bulletproof. I have the ledger, Eleanor. I have the receipts. So here is my counteroffer. If you ever approach me without a lawyer again, I am sending your charity's entire financial ledger directly to the state attorney general. I will have you indicted for charity fraud and tax evasion before the weekend is over." Eleanor let out a choked whimper. She scrambled backward, fumbling blindly with the deadbolt. She yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway, her designer heels slipping on the polished marble floor as she fled in absolute panic. I washed my hands methodically, watching the torn pieces of her $50,000 bribe turn to mush in the wet sink. I dried my hands and walked out of the restroom, feeling the immense weight of the power I now held. But as I rounded the corner toward the main lobby, I froze. Eleanor was pacing frantically near the exit doors, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. She was completely oblivious to my presence. "Beatrice, the money did not work," Eleanor whispered hysterically into the phone. "She knows everything. She knows about the charity. We have to move right now. Call David. Tell him to get to the daycare facility before she does. If we grab Zuri before the judge signs the new temporary orders, possession is 9/10 of the law. Just get the baby and lock her in the estate. Naomi cannot stop us if we already have the child." My blood turned to ice. They were not backing down. They were escalating. I turned and sprinted toward the courthouse parking garage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The legal ping-pong was over. It was a race for my daughter's life. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my sedan and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. I ignored every speed limit and ran 2 yellow lights to get to the Little Lambs Learning Center. My tires screeched against the pavement as I swerved into the loading zone. I burst through the double glass doors, ignoring the startled receptionist, and sprinted straight to the toddler room. I scooped Zuri up into my arms, holding her warm little body tightly against my chest. She giggled, grabbing a fistful of my hair, completely unaware of the absolute panic radiating through my veins. As I turned back toward the entrance, I saw David pushing through the front doors. He was Marcus Loyal, head of security, a massive man built like a tank. We locked eyes across the brightly lit lobby. He saw the fierce, unyielding look on my face, and he saw that Zuri was already securely in my arms. I did not break eye contact as I walked right past him. He knew he was too late, and he knew better than to try and snatch a child from her mother in front of 5 daycare workers and a lobby full of surveillance cameras. I strapped Zuri into her car seat and drove straight back to my father's building, sealing us inside the penthouse fortress. The adrenaline took hours to fade. I sat on the plush living room rug, watching Zuri play with her blocks, my phone resting silently on the coffee table. When it finally buzzed, it was not a threat from Beatrice or a legal demand from Marcus. It was an alert from Diane Chen, my attorney. She had forwarded me a link to Instagram with a single text attached. "Look at how they are controlling the narrative." I tapped the link and felt my stomach violently turn. Chloe, the daughter of the disgraced billionaire Arthur Sterling, had posted a highly stylized professional maternity photo shoot. She was standing in a sunlit field wearing a flowing white lace gown that caught the breeze perfectly. Marcus stood behind her, looking like the picture of pastoral devotion, his hands resting gently on her visibly rounded stomach. In the second photo, Chloe was holding up a glossy sonogram picture. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in religious manipulation. "God works in mysterious and beautiful ways," she wrote. "After a season of darkness, Marcus and I are so incredibly blessed to announce that we are expecting our miracle child." A miracle child. She was 4 months pregnant. I did the math instantly. Marcus had been sleeping with her in our marital bed while I was recovering from a difficult childbirth. He had fathered a child with another woman while preaching sermons about the sanctity of holy matrimony every single Sunday. But the absolute worst part was the comment section. It was a tidal wave of praise from the Oasis megachurch congregation. The very same women who had called me a Jezebel just 48 hours ago were now leaving heart emojis and praising Jesus for this beautiful new chapter. They were openly celebrating the product of an adulterous affair, rebranding Marcus' infidelity as divine intervention just to protect the church's pristine image. They were completely brainwashed, and Beatrice was clearly the puppet master pulling the strings. She realized her attempt to buy me off had failed spectacularly. She realized her attempt to kidnap Zuri had been thwarted, so she resorted to the oldest trick in her corrupt playbook: retaliation. The next morning, my father and I were downstairs in the auto shop going over some financial records while Zuri napped securely upstairs. The large rolling garage doors were open to let in the crisp morning air. A man wearing a crisp brown uniform and carrying a metal clipboard marched onto the shop floor. He wore a badge identifying him as a city building inspector, but I recognized him immediately. It was Deacon Miller, one of the head ushers at Oasis Megachurch, and a man who did whatever Beatrice commanded. He did not even look at me. He walked straight up to the main load-bearing wall and started scribbling furiously on his clipboard. Then he pulled a massive, bright red sticker from his pocket and slapped it directly onto the front glass door of the office. "By order of the city, this building is officially condemned," Deacon Miller announced, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. "I have found multiple severe code violations, structural instability, hazardous waste containment failure, and massive fire code breaches. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. If you are found inside this building after that time, you will be arrested for trespassing and child endangerment." He smirked at me, adjusting his utility belt. Beatrice had sent him to render me legally homeless. If I had no fixed address, the family court judge would have no choice but to grant Marcus emergency custody. It was a vicious, calculated ping-pong conflict designed to break me down. I stepped forward, ready to unleash a barrage of legal threats, ready to demand his badge number and call my lawyer. But my father, Elias, stepped in front of me. He did not yell. He did not argue with the corrupt inspector. He did not even look angry. He calmly wiped a smudge of motor oil from his hands using a clean shop towel. Then he reached into his grease-stained overalls and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number and held it to his ear, his eyes locked dead onto Deacon Miller. He spoke exactly 2 sentences into the receiver. "We have a rogue city employee playing games at my residential property. Deal with it immediately." He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. We stood in complete silence for exactly 10 minutes. Deacon Miller tried to maintain his smug posture, but the utter lack of panic from my father was clearly making him nervous. He shifted his weight, checking his watch and glancing toward the street. Suddenly, a sleek black municipal town car screeched to a halt right in front of the open garage bays. The back doors flew open, and 2 men scrambled out looking absolutely terrified. One was the director of city planning, and the other was the chief building commissioner. They practically sprinted onto the shop floor, sweating through their expensive suits. "Mr. Elias, we are so incredibly sorry," the commissioner gasped, breathless and pale. "We had no idea this unauthorized inspection was taking place. This is a complete violation of protocol." The commissioner turned his panicked gaze toward Deacon Miller, who was now standing frozen, his mouth hanging open in shock. "Give me your badge," the commissioner bellowed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Give me your badge and your clipboard right this second. You are fired. Do not even bother going back to the municipal building. Your career is over." The director of city planning practically threw himself at the glass office door, clawing frantically at the bright red condemnation sticker until he had ripped it completely off the glass. He crumpled it into a ball and shoved it into his pocket, bowing his head toward my father in a gesture of absolute subservience. "We will ensure this property is never targeted again, Mr. Elias," the director stammered, backing away toward the town car. "Please accept our deepest apologies." They dragged the disgraced, terrified Deacon Miller out of the garage, shoving him toward the street before scrambling back into their town car and speeding away. The entire confrontation was over, leaving behind a deafening silence. My father tossed the dirty shop towel onto a nearby workbench. He turned to face me, his dark eyes gleaming with a cold, calculated fire. "It is time to teach them who owns this city," Elias said. Elias did not waste a single second. He walked straight to the steel filing cabinet in the back of the shop and unlocked the bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio that contained the operational assets of his primary holding company. Marcus and Beatrice had spent their entire lives judging people by the labels on their clothes and the cars they drove. They were completely blinded by their own arrogance. They had no idea that my father actively controlled half the commercial real estate in the downtown district. I looked over Elias' shoulder as he opened the portfolio and tapped a heavy grease-stained finger against a specific property deed. Marcus was hosting his most critical political fundraising gala that exact evening. With Arthur Sterling's illegal offshore accounts completely frozen by the IRS, Marcus was financially starving. His city council campaign was bleeding cash, and he needed to rally his wealthiest donors to keep his political ambitions alive. He had rented out the grand atrium of his own campaign headquarters for the event. It was a massive historic brick and glass building situated in the most expensive zip code in the city. Marcus loved that building. He plastered photos of it all over his campaign literature because it projected an image of absolute stability and elite power. He had signed a 5-year commercial lease on the property, assuming the faceless holding company listed on the paperwork was just another corporate entity. He never bothered to check the actual board of directors. He never bothered to verify who was cashing his campaign rent checks every single month. "We are going to the gala," I told my father, feeling a cold spike of anticipation in my chest. Elias nodded and closed the portfolio. "Wear something nice." he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We have an eviction to serve." 4 hours later, I walked through the heavy revolving doors of the downtown campaign headquarters. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying my father's leather portfolio. Elias walked beside me, flanked by 4 of his private security contractors. They were massive men in dark suits who moved with quiet, terrifying efficiency. The grand atrium was packed with the political elite of the city. Wealthy donors, local business owners, and prominent members of the Oasis megachurch congregation mingled under the massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of champagne. Marcus stood on a raised podium at the front of the room holding a microphone. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, his golden smile perfectly fixed in place. Chloe stood near the front row wearing a tight emerald gown that deliberately accentuated her 4-month pregnancy bump. Marcus was right in the middle of a passionate speech about family values and community restoration. He was playing the victim perfectly, telling his wealthy donors that he was facing immense spiritual warfare but remaining steadfast in his godly mission. It was a brilliant performance, until my father gave a silent hand signal to his lead security contractor. The man walked calmly over to the main electrical breaker panel hidden behind a velvet curtain near the entrance. He opened the metal box and pulled the primary master switch. Every single crystal chandelier in the grand atrium went pitch black. The microphone cut out instantly, leaving Marcus mid-sentence in the sudden dead silence. The wealthy donors gasped, dropping their champagne glasses and murmuring in confusion. The entire building plunged into absolute darkness for exactly 10 seconds. Then the emergency backup generators kicked in. A single harsh spotlight illuminated the main entrance doors. Elias and I stepped directly into the circle of light. The crowd parted instantly, backing away from the imposing wall of my father's security detail. The sea of elite donors whispered frantically, pointing at me as I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the atrium. I did not look at the crowd. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the man standing on the podium. Marcus squinted against the glare of the emergency lights. When he finally recognized my face, his golden smile collapsed. He gripped the edge of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning white. Beatrice, who had been sitting in the front row, stood up so fast she knocked her chair backward. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room without the microphone. "Security, get this woman out of my building." I stopped exactly 10 feet from the podium. I unzipped the leather portfolio and pulled out the original master property deed, stamped with the official county seal. "Your building?" I asked, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "I think you need to check your lease agreement, Marcus." I held up the heavy parchment paper so the entire front row of wealthy donors could see the embossed legal seal. "You pay rent to a corporate entity called Ironwood Holdings," I stated, projecting my voice so it reached the very back of the atrium. "You assumed it was just a faceless management firm, but if your high-paid lawyers had bothered to do a basic background check, they would have realized that Ironwood Holdings is a subsidiary of my father's development empire. He bought this entire downtown block 3 years ago." The silence in the room was absolute. The elite donors stared at me and then turned to look at Marcus. The realization that the polished junior pastor was funneling his campaign funds directly into the pockets of the mechanic he constantly mocked was incredibly humiliating. I walked up to the edge of the podium and slammed a bright red legal document directly onto the wooden surface right over his carefully prepared speech notes. "You threw me out of the snow on Christmas, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, lethal blade. "You have until Friday to get your campaign out of my father's building." Marcus stared at the bright red 3-day eviction notice. His chest heaved rapidly. The perfectly crafted mask of the godly public servant completely shattered. The public humiliation of being exposed and evicted in front of his primary financial lifelines broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. He let out a visceral, furious scream. He lunged entirely over the wooden podium, his hands outstretched, aiming directly for my throat. He never even made it past the first step. My father's security contractors moved with lightning speed. Two massive men intercepted Marcus in midair, grabbing him by the shoulders and slamming him violently face first onto the polished marble floor. They pinned his arms behind his back, driving a heavy knee between his shoulder blades. Marcus thrashed wildly against the marble, screaming profanities and spitting absolute venom. The wealthy donors recoiled in absolute horror. The women gasped, clutching their evening gowns and backing toward the exits. The men stared in disgust at the junior pastor writhing on the floor like a feral animal. The polished, respectable image Marcus had spent a decade building was completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. "He is unstable," one of the prominent donors muttered, shaking his head in disgust. "We are leaving." The crowd instantly surged toward the exits. The very people Marcus needed to finance his political survival were walking out the door, terrified by the violent, unhinged display they had just witnessed. Beatrice screamed for the donors to stay, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of fleeing footsteps. I stood over Marcus, looking down at him pinned to the cold marble floor of my father's building. I did not say another word. I simply turned my back on him and walked out into the cool night air, leaving his empire in ruins. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The adrenaline from the gala had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. I had a crucial pediatric appointment scheduled for Zuri. She had developed a slight wheeze during the sudden winter freeze, and today was her specialized follow-up with the pulmonary clinic. It was a vital visit to secure her daily inhaler prescription and ensure her lungs were clear. I dressed her warmly in a thick knitted sweater and drove to the upscale medical building on the west side of the city. The receptionist at the front desk was a kind woman who always kept a jar of organic lollipops on her counter. She smiled brightly as we approached and asked for my updated insurance card. I handed it to her, balancing Zuri on my hip. The receptionist swiped the card through her terminal. Her warm smile faltered immediately. She frowned at her computer monitor and swiped the card a second time. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, her brow furrowing in deep distress. She looked up at me with profound apology in her eyes. "I am so sorry, Naomi," she whispered, glancing around the waiting room. "The system is showing that this policy was completely terminated at midnight. It says the primary policyholder canceled the coverage for all dependents." My blood ran completely cold. The primary policyholder was Marcus. He had deliberately canceled his own infant daughter's health insurance right before a critical pulmonary exam. He knew exactly when this appointment was scheduled. He knew Zuri needed her medication. It was a calculated, vicious attempt to force me into submission. He was literally using our child's ability to breathe as a bargaining chip to assert his dominance. Before I could even process the sheer depravity of his actions, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from Eleanor. She was clearly trying to claw her way back into Beatrice and Marcus' good graces after I had exposed her fraudulent charity scheme. She was playing the role of their loyal attack dog perfectly. I opened the message. It read exactly as follows. A good mother would come back to the church and apologize to get her baby's health insurance reinstated. Do the right thing, Naomi, before Zuri really gets hurt. They were gloating. They honestly thought they had me backed into a corner. They believed that by cutting off my access to the elite church-funded health plan, I would have no choice but to crawl back to the sanctuary, beg for their forgiveness, and hand over my daughter to avoid medical bankruptcy. They thought financial terrorism would break my spirit. I did not panic. I did not text Eleanor back with a desperate plea. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked directly at the receptionist, who was watching me with mounting sympathy. "What is the total premium cost to insure a pediatric dependent for the entire year?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any tremor. The receptionist blinked in surprise. She clicked through a few screens on her terminal. For the comprehensive premium tier, without any corporate subsidy, it is exactly $8,400. She looked at me apologetically. "I can try to set up a payment plan if you need to consult with a social worker." "That will not be necessary," I replied. I set Zuri down gently in the designated play area right next to the reception desk. Then I unzipped my oversized leather tote bag. My father Elias had taught me to never walk into a war zone without ammunition. When you are fighting wealthy, corrupt people, liquid capital is the only language they understand. He had sent me to the clinic with a massive contingency fund. I reached into the bag and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. I opened the flap and began placing banded stacks of crisp $100 bills directly onto the glass counter. I counted out exactly $8,400 in cold, hard cash, aligning the stacks perfectly. The receptionist stared at the money, her jaw practically hitting the floor. The other mothers in the waiting room fell completely silent, watching the display with wide eyes. "I would like to pay the premium in full right now," I stated, sliding the cash across the counter. "And I need you to print out the official patient intake registry forms. I need to make an immediate administrative correction to this file." The receptionist scrambled to collect the cash and quickly printed a stack of documents. She slid them toward me along with a pen. I took the pen and flipped to the primary identification page. I drew a thick, heavy line straight through Marcus' last name. I crossed out his contact information. I removed him as the emergency contact. In the section designated for the child's legal surname, I wrote down my father's family name in bold, dark ink. I officially erased Marcus from her medical history. Zuri was no longer his property. I signed the bottom of the form and pushed it back across the glass. "Process that immediately," I commanded. I carried Zuri into the examination room, secured her prescription, and walked out of the clinic feeling a dangerous new energy coursing through my veins. Eleanor and Marcus wanted to play a game of financial warfare. They wanted to weaponize money to control me. They had fundamentally forgotten who they were dealing with. I was not just a scorned wife. I was a senior forensic tax auditor. I knew exactly where every single drop of their money lived. I strapped Zuri into her car seat and climbed into the driver's side of my sedan. I did not start the engine. Instead, I pulled my encrypted work laptop from my bag and rested it on the steering wheel. I powered it up and logged directly into the secure federal banking portals. Marcus had always been arrogant and sloppy. For years, he had illegally tied his personal marital accounts to the Oasis megachurch operational payroll to hide his lavish bonus structures and untaxed income. He used our joint accounts as a staging ground for the church's massive bi-weekly payroll distributions. He assumed I was too docile to ever look at the routing numbers. I accessed the master marital account. Because I was still legally his wife, and my name was still on the primary banking charter, I had complete, unmitigated authorization to contest any linked disbursements. I opened the church's master payroll file. I selected the entire employee roster, including Marcus, his aggressive lawyers, Beatrice, Eleanor, and every corrupt contractor on their payroll. With a few rapid keystrokes, I submitted a formal, legally binding freeze on the entire routing network, citing the unauthorized transfer of contested marital assets during an active divorce proceeding. I hit the execute button. The screen flashed green, confirming the administrative lock. I had just initiated a full systemic freeze on Marcus' entire church payroll. Not a single employee, pastor, or vendor would receive a dime until the family court resolved the asset dispute. I closed the laptop, feeling a cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. I looked in the rearview mirror at my daughter sleeping peacefully in her car seat. Marcus wanted to starve us out. Now his entire empire was going to find out exactly what starvation felt like. The fallout from my digital strike on the church payroll system was instantaneous and catastrophic. By Friday morning, every single staff member, contractor, and associate pastor at Oasis Megachurch woke up to completely frozen bank accounts. The internal panic was absolute, but Beatrice Sterling never backed down from a crisis. She simply reframed it. She immediately ordered the pastoral team to declare a mandatory healing Sunday. If the digital accounts were locked down by legal tape, she was going to rely on the oldest trick in the corrupt megachurch playbook, a massive in-person cash offering. When Sunday morning arrived, the sanctuary was packed to its absolute maximum capacity. I stood hidden in the darkened foyer watching the live feed on the massive overflow monitors. The production value was sickeningly perfect. Soft blue stage lights illuminated the altar. A backing band played a slow, emotional worship anthem designed to pull at the heartstrings of the congregation. Marcus stood center stage, gripping a wireless microphone, looking like a weary but fiercely faithful martyr. Chloe stood right beside him, wearing a modest but incredibly expensive white maternity dress, resting her hand protectively on her pregnant belly, while gazing up at him with manufactured devotion. "We are under a severe spiritual attack," Marcus preached, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. "The enemy is trying to starve this ministry. The enemy is using bitterness and vindictive legal maneuvers to shut our doors and punish my growing family. But we will not be broken. We will rely on the unwavering faith of this congregation to sow a miraculous financial seed today. We need you to dig deep and give in cash so that the glorious work of the Lord is not hindered by petty worldly disputes." The congregation erupted into thunderous applause. Women in the front rows were actually wiping away tears. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that Marcus was begging for their hard-earned cash to fund his mistress's luxury lifestyle and cover his frozen illicit assets. It was the most disgusting display of manipulation I had ever witnessed. And it was exactly the opening I needed. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main sanctuary. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not storm the stage like a scorned, hysterical ex-wife. I simply walked down the center aisle with the cold, calculating precision of a forensic auditor who had already won the war. The rhythmic click of my heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed clearly beneath the soft worship music. It took about 5 seconds for the congregation to notice me. The applause faltered. The whispers began spreading like wildfire across the wooden pews. Heads turned row by row as thousands of eyes locked onto me. I wore a sharp, tailored crimson suit, holding a single thick manila envelope in my right hand. Marcus saw me when I was halfway to the altar. The color instantly drained from his perfectly tanned face. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. The microphone dropped slightly from his mouth, emitting a low hum of static. Chloe let out a sharp gasp and instinctively stepped behind Marcus, clutching his suit jacket. Beatrice, who was seated in her usual throne-like chair in the front row, stood up so fast her program scattered across the marble floor. I ignored all of them. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the massive velvet-lined collection baskets resting on the edge of the altar. The music slowly faded out as the backing band realized something was terribly wrong. The silence in the sanctuary became absolute and suffocating. I reached the front row and stopped directly in front of Marcus. He looked down at me from the stage, his chest heaving, his golden boy facade completely cracking under the weight of my calm, unyielding stare. "Naomi?" He hissed, his voice barely a whisper but picked up perfectly by his sensitive lapel microphone. "You are trespassing. Get out of my church right now." I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute chilling clarity. As a major financial contributor to this church and a legally recognized marital partner to its primary banking charter, I am formally triggering a forensic audit of the pastoral discretionary fund I announced. A collective gasp rippled through the thousands of seated members. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding financial notices. I held them up for the front row to see before dropping the entire heavy stack directly into the velvet collection basket. "You have been stealing from these people, Marcus," I continued, my voice echoing across the silent sanctuary. "You have been funneling untaxed tithes into luxury real estate offshore accounts and shell companies to finance your infidelity. You are asking them for cash today because I froze your accounts. And I have the routing numbers to prove every single word." Beatrice completely lost her mind. The elegant, pious matriarch mask dissolved into pure venomous panic. She scrambled out of her row, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. "Get her out of this sanctuary!" Beatrice shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Ushers, remove this woman immediately. She is a liar and a trespasser. Drag her out of here." 4 massive men wearing identical dark usher suits stepped out from the side aisles. They were part of Marcus' personal security detail, the same men who usually intimidated dissenting staff members into silence. They moved toward me with dark, aggressive intent, cracking their knuckles and reaching out to grab my arms. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply glanced over my shoulder toward the main entrance. "Stop right there!" a booming voice commanded from the back of the room. The heavy oak doors had swung open again. Two men and one woman wearing crisp gray suits marched swiftly down the center aisle. They were not church members. They were not private security. They had silver badges clipped to their belts and carried thick leather briefcases. The ushers froze in their tracks. They looked at the approaching agents and immediately backed away, raising their hands in surrender. No private church security guard was going to risk assaulting federal agents in front of 3,000 witnesses. The lead agent walked straight past me and stepped right up to the edge of the altar. He pulled a sealed document from his inside pocket and held it out toward a trembling Marcus. "Marcus Sterling." The agent stated, his voice carrying absolute federal authority. "We are with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. You are hereby served with a federal subpoena for tax evasion, wire fraud, and charity embezzlement." The sanctuary erupted into pure, absolute chaos. Marcus dropped the microphone. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening screech of feedback that made the front row of wealthy donors cover their ears. The golden boy of Oasis Megachurch was suddenly trembling uncontrollably, staring at the federal agents like they were the Grim Reaper. Beatrice clutched her chest and sank back into her throne-like chair, her carefully manicured facade melting into sheer terror. Chloe took 3 rapid steps away from Marcus, treating the father of her miracle child like a contagious disease. I did not stay to watch the agents place the handcuffs on his custom-tailored wrists. I simply turned around and walked back up the center aisle. The massive congregation parted from me in stunned, absolute silence. I stepped out into the bright Sunday morning sunlight, leaving the heavy oak doors closing on the total destruction of their fraudulent empire. The CPS ambush-cornered animals are always the most dangerous. Eleanor had watched the entire spectacular downfall from the elevated choir loft. She knew her fraudulent women in ministry charity was next on the federal chopping block. She knew she was facing imminent prison time, and her pristine socialite life was completely over. In her twisted mind, there was only one person to blame for the collapse of the Sterling dynasty: me. If she was going to lose everything, she decided I was going to lose the only thing that mattered to me. Eleanor retreated to her luxury SUV parked 3 blocks away from the church. She locked the doors, pulled out her smartphone, and navigated to the state child welfare emergency portal. She did not use her real name. She disguised herself as a deeply concerned, anonymous citizen. She typed out a horrific, fabricated narrative claiming that a young child named Zuri was being held captive in a toxic, hazardous auto mechanic garage. She painted a vivid lie of severe, immediate neglect, describing industrial chemicals, heavy machinery, and a mentally unstable mother holding a toddler in a dangerous industrial zone. She hit submit, demanding a priority emergency intervention. She knew exactly how the system worked, and she knew an emergency priority flag required a mandatory visit within 48 hours. The visit. 2 days later, I was sitting in the sunlit living room of my father's penthouse. The space was pristine, featuring gleaming hardwood floors and expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Zuri was happily stacking brightly colored wooden blocks on a plush white rug, her giggles echoing through the quiet apartment. My father was downstairs managing the classic car restoration shop. The heavy brass knocker on our reinforced front steel door sounded twice. It was a sharp, authoritative rhythm. I stood up, smoothing my shirt, and opened the door. 2 women stood in the hallway. They wore practical business attire and carried thick official clipboards. The silver badges clipped to their lapels identified them as investigators for the State Department of Child Protective Services. Miss Naomi Sterling, the younger investigator, asked, her face locked in a severe, unyielding professional mask. "We received an emergency anonymous priority tip regarding the safety and living conditions of a minor child in your immediate care. We are required by law to enter and inspect the premises immediately to ensure the safety of the toddler." I felt a sudden, icy spike of adrenaline shoot through my veins. I stepped back, but before I let them inside, I glanced past their shoulders toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Down on the street, parked illegally next to a fire hydrant, was a familiar silver Range Rover. I could clearly see the silhouette of Eleanor sitting in the driver's seat, holding her smartphone up against the steering wheel. She was actively recording the entrance to the building. She was waiting to capture the exact moment state agents carried my crying toddler out of the auto shop. She wanted to post my ultimate destruction on the internet and cement her false narrative that I was an unfit mother. The twist. I pulled the door wide open. "Come in," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of panic. The younger investigator marched into the living room, her eyes darting aggressively around, searching for filth hazards or industrial waste. She found nothing but an immaculate luxury penthouse, expensive educational toys, and a perfectly healthy, happy toddler playing in the morning sun. The senior supervisor followed her inside, closing the door behind her. She was an older woman with sharp, perceptive eyes and decades of experience written on her face. She looked at the pristine apartment, then looked directly at my face. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her official's severe expression instantly vanished completely, replaced by absolute profound shock. "Naomi," she gasped, lowering her clipboard to her side. "Naomi, is that you?" I looked closely at the older woman, and a genuine smile broke across my face. It was Brenda Hayes, the Regional Director of Child Protective Services. 3 years ago, the state child welfare program had been hemorrhaging millions of dollars. Good foster families were not getting paid, and critical care facilities were being shut down due to budget deficits. I was the senior forensic auditor the state hired to track the missing money. I spent 6 grueling months meticulously tearing through encrypted banking records until I exposed a massive embezzlement ring operating inside the state treasury. I recovered $12 million for the foster care system, saving Brenda's entire department from collapse. She had personally presented me with a civilian commendation award at a private state banquet. I was not a suspect to her. I was the woman who saved the most vulnerable children in the state. "The hook, Brenda, what is going on?" I asked, gesturing to the younger investigator who now looked incredibly confused by her supervisor's reaction. Brenda shook her head, her face flushed with sudden intense anger. She turned to her junior associate. "Close that file right now," she commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "This is Naomi, the forensic auditor I told you about. The woman who saved our funding. There is absolutely zero chance this child is in any danger." The younger investigator snapped her clipboard shut, her face turning bright red with embarrassment. "Someone filed a malicious priority report," Brenda explained, her voice trembling with professional outrage. "They claimed you were keeping your baby in a toxic chop shop surrounded by hazardous chemicals. I told my staff to flag any anonymous reports generated from this specific residential block because of the high-profile divorce proceedings." Brenda pulled a digital tablet from her leather briefcase. "The state upgraded our intake system after your audit, Naomi. Every anonymous digital tip automatically logs the originating IP address and device registry to prevent weaponized false reporting. We track the digital footprint instantly." She tapped the screen rapidly, pulling up the intake log for the emergency tip. "This report was filed from a registered mobile device connected to a localized cellular tower right outside this building," Brenda read off the screen, her eyes narrowing. "It traces directly to an account registered to an Eleanor Sterling." I did not say a word. I simply pointed toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Brenda walked over to the glass and looked down at the street below. She saw the silver Range Rover. She saw Eleanor pointing her phone camera directly up at the penthouse window, waiting for a tragedy that was never going to happen. Brenda pulled out her own cell phone and dialed the direct line to the local police precinct commander. "Filing a fabricated emergency child abuse report is a Class E felony," Brenda stated, her eyes locked onto Eleanor's vehicle with absolute fury. "And she is sitting right outside waiting for the show. Send a squad car. We have a felony arrest to make." 2 minutes later, the wail of police sirens shattered the quiet morning air. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, holding Zuri securely against my hip, and watched the scene unfold on the street below. 2 black and white squad cars swerved in front of Eleanor's silver Range Rover, boxing her in completely. 4 armed officers approached her vehicle. Eleanor tried to roll up her window and lock the doors, but they ordered her out of the car. Even from the height of the penthouse, I could hear her screaming about her wealth, her zip code, and her powerful family. She thrashed wildly, her perfectly smoothed blonde hair falling into her face as the officers forcefully turned her around and clamped heavy steel handcuffs over her wrists. The smug socialite who had tried to bribe me with a ripped cashier's check was now being shoved into the back of a police cruiser facing felony charges that would ruin her life. Brenda Hayes stood beside me watching the cruiser speed away. She gave me a firm nod of solidarity before heading back to her office to finalize the arrest report. One Sterling was officially down, but the war was far from over. Beatrice Sterling was a creature of absolute vanity and desperate pride. With her church accounts completely frozen by my federal audit and her daughter Eleanor sitting in a county jail cell, Beatrice needed a spectacular public relations miracle. She needed to control the narrative and project an image of divine blessing to the wealthy donors who were rapidly fleeing their congregation. So she resorted to the only tactic she knew. She threw an obscene amount of money at the problem. Beatrice orchestrated a lavish $30,000 gender reveal party for Chloe and Marcus. She rented out the grand ballroom of the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club, an elite venue dripping with crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors. She invited the entire city elite, the remaining church elders, and the wealthiest local politicians. She transformed the ballroom into a sickeningly sweet pastoral wonderland with imported white roses, massive ice sculptures, and towers of pink and blue French macarons. It was a calculated theatrical display designed to paint Marcus and Chloe as blessed victims of a vindictive, bitter ex-wife. I was not at the country club. I was sitting comfortably at my desk in my father's auto shop, sipping a cup of black coffee and watching the digital clock on my computer monitor tick closer to 3 in the afternoon. I did not need to be in the ballroom to ruin their lives. I had already set the ultimate trap. While Marcus was busy dodging IRS agents and preaching sermons about his miraculous new chapter, I had hired a top-tier private investigator. I knew Marcus. I knew he was incapable of loyalty. But more importantly, I knew Chloe. I knew she was a master manipulator who would sleep with anyone to secure her place in the Sterling dynasty. My private investigator had tracked Chloe to an exclusive prenatal clinic on the north side of the city. He waited patiently until she left, and then legally acquired her discarded medical waste from a designated public disposal bin. It was a simple, non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Because I was still legally married to Marcus and had previously managed the comprehensive health insurance profiles for the entire Sterling family, I already possessed the genetic baseline markers for the Sterling bloodline. I paid a private certified laboratory to run the cross-analysis. The results had arrived on my desk in a sealed crimson envelope exactly 24 hours ago. At exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, a uniformed courier walked through the heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom. He bypassed the security detail and walked straight up the center aisle, carrying a beautifully wrapped pristine white box tied with an elegant gold ribbon. Marcus was standing on the raised stage holding a microphone. He was wearing a custom-tailored ivory suit, his golden smile perfectly fixed in place. Chloe stood beside him, wearing a tight designer gown that proudly displayed her pregnancy. Beatrice sat in the front row, beaming with manufactured pride, as the city elite watched the happy couple. The courier stepped onto the stage and handed the white box directly to Marcus. Marcus took the box and looked at the return address label. His golden smile widened into an expression of absolute arrogant triumph. He tapped the microphone, demanding the attention of the entire ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing, and the wealthy guests turned toward the stage in silent anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice echoing through the opulent room. "It seems the Lord is working miracles of reconciliation today. We have just received a gift from my former wife, Naomi. I know she has struggled with bitterness. I know she has let jealousy cloud her heart. But this beautiful gift is a sign that she has finally accepted God's plan for my growing family. She has finally surrendered." Beatrice clapped her hands together in the front row, wiping a fake tear from her eye. The congregation murmured in approval, touched by Marcus' profound godly grace. "Let us open this peace offering together," Marcus proclaimed, untying the gold ribbon with a theatrical flourish. He pulled the lid off the white box. There were no baby booties inside. There was no silver rattle. There was only a thick, heavy certified laboratory binder stamped with a massive red legal seal. Marcus reached into the box and pulled out the binder. He flipped it open, resting it on the podium. He looked down at the primary summary page. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His confident golden smile collapsed into an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. His hands began to shake violently, rattling the heavy paper against the wooden podium. Chloe leaned over, trying to look at the document. "What is it, baby?" she whispered, reaching for his arm. Marcus slapped her hand away, his eyes wide and frantic. He stared at the bold black text printed across the center of the page. It was a certified legal DNA paternity test. And under the section labeled Probability of Paternity for Marcus Sterling, there was a single devastating number, 0%. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. The wealthy donors stared at the stage, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. But the nightmare was not over. Marcus' eyes tracked down to the secondary familial match section. The laboratory had confirmed that the baby belonged to the Sterling bloodline. The genetic markers were a direct, undeniable match. But they did not belong to him. The paper clearly stated the biological father of Chloe's miracle child. It was David, Marcus' older brother and his loyal, brutal head of security. Marcus let out a choked, visceral gasp. He dropped the microphone. It hit the stage floor with a deafening screech of feedback that made the entire front row flinch. The heavy certified laboratory binder slipped from his trembling hands and scattered across the stage the undeniable proof of Chloe's ultimate betrayal displayed for the entire city elite to see. For 3 agonizing seconds, the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club was trapped in a vacuum of absolute silence. The scattered pages of the DNA report fluttered across the polished stage floor. The city elite stared in collective shock. Then the pristine respectability politics of the Sterling family shattered completely. Eleanor was the first to snap. The federal audit of her fake charity and her recent felony arrest for the fabricated Child Protective Services report had already pushed her to the absolute brink of madness. She had attended this lavish $30,000 gender reveal party on an exorbitant bail bond orchestrated by Beatrice specifically to maintain the public illusion of family unity. But seeing the undeniable proof that Chloe's unborn miracle child belonged to David, the rugged head of security, and Marcus' own brother, was the final match in a highly volatile powder keg, Eleanor completely dropped her refined white savior persona. "You filthy parasitic homewrecker!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual melodic southern charm. She kicked off her designer heels and lunged across the stage. Chloe barely had time to raise her hands before Eleanor tackled her. The impact sent both women crashing backward into the grand floral arrangements. Eleanor grabbed a fistful of Chloe's perfectly styled blonde hair and yanked backward, ripping a string of expensive extensions right out of her scalp. Chloe screamed, clawing wildly at Eleanor's face with her manicured acrylic nails, leaving deep red scratches across her cheeks. The elegant white maternity gown tore at the shoulder, exposing Chloe's expensive undergarments. They rolled across the imported white roses, screaming vicious obscenities that no devoted megachurch member should ever know. Marcus did not even look at his pregnant mistress. His eyes were locked entirely on David. David had been standing near the edge of the stage wearing his signature dark security suit, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He did not look ashamed. He looked incredibly defiant. He had always hated playing second fiddle to his golden boy younger brother. David was the muscle, the enforcer, the man who handled the dark realities of the church, while Marcus bathed in the adoration and the wealth. Sleeping with Chloe had been his ultimate quiet victory. He stepped forward, his jaw set tight. Marcus let out a feral roar that echoed through the massive ballroom. He charged his older brother with blind, unhinged fury. He tackled David by the waist, launching both of them right off the edge of the elevated stage. They flew through the air and crashed directly into the lavish dessert display. The impact was deafening. The heavy wooden table collapsed instantly under the weight of two grown men fighting for their lives. A spectacular six-tier vanilla buttercream cake exploded across the dance floor. The towering displays of pink and blue French macarons shattered, sending hundreds of crushed pastries raining down like sugary shrapnel. Marcus straddled David, swinging his fists wildly. He landed a brutal punch across David's jaw. David spat a mouthful of blood and buttercream onto the polished floor before grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his custom ivory suit and throwing him hard against the remnants of a sculpted ice swan. The frozen sculpture shattered completely, slicing through Marcus' expensive jacket. They wrestled in the ruins of the dessert table, slipping and sliding in the thick layers of frosting and shattered glass, destroying the $30,000 aesthetic in mere seconds. Beatrice was beside herself. The reigning matriarch of Oasis Megachurch could not fathom the public destruction of her empire. She scrambled out of her front row seat, her face flushed purple with rage and utter humiliation. "Stop it! This instant!" Beatrice screamed, waving her arms frantically. "You are embarrassing this family. Get off him, Marcus!" She marched onto the dance floor, intending to physically pull her warring sons apart. But Beatrice severely underestimated the slickness of vanilla buttercream on polished marble. As she stormed toward the brawl, her expensive designer heel caught a massive smear of pink frosting. Her legs flew out from under her. Beatrice Sterling, the elegant, untouchable queen of the city elite, went airborne. She landed flat on her back with a sickening thud, sliding straight into the epicenter of the brawl. Her pristine $5,000 silk gown was instantly ruined, completely coated in a thick, sticky mixture of blue cake icing, crushed macarons, and melting ice water. She flailed on the ground, her elegant updo collapsing into a tangled, sticky mess, screaming for the country club security to intervene. Nobody intervened. The wealthy congregants, the local politicians, and the city elite did not rush forward to break up the fight. They did exactly what modern society conditions people to do during a spectacular public meltdown. They pulled out their smartphones. Hundreds of camera flashes illuminated the ballroom. Red recording lights blinked from every angle. Guests were live streaming the entire catastrophic brawl directly to social media. They zoomed in on Eleanor ripping Chloe's dress. They captured Marcus and David throwing bloody punches in a pile of cake. They framed Beatrice perfectly as she thrashed helplessly in a puddle of blue frosting, shouting orders that no one followed. Within minutes, the wholly perfect facade of the Sterling family was permanently disgraced on the internet. The viral clips were already racking up thousands of views, spreading across local news networks and gossip blogs before the country club staff could even call the police. The megachurch dynasty was literally bleeding out in front of the entire world. I watched the live streams from the quiet safety of my father's auto shop, leaning back in my leather chair with a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I did not need to lift a single finger. They were destroying themselves. Back in the ballroom, the chaos finally reached its breaking point. Country club security guards rushed into the room, blowing whistles and physically dragging Marcus and David apart. The brothers were panting, covered in blood and cake, staring at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. Eleanor was pulled off Chloe by two waiters, her face scratched and bleeding. Beatrice was struggling to sit up, her ruined dress clinging heavily to her frame. A man stepped through the circle of recording guests. It was Arthur Vance, Chloe's father, and one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the state. He possessed a ruthless business acumen and absolutely zero tolerance for public humiliation. His face was a mask of cold, hard fury. He walked past his crying daughter and stepped directly over the shattered ice sculpture to stand over Beatrice, who was still trying to wipe cake from her eyes. He looked down at her with absolute disgust. "Arthur," Beatrice stammered, reaching out a sticky hand. "Arthur, please, we can explain everything. This is a simple misunderstanding." Arthur Vance did not reach out to help her up. He stared at the ruined matriarch and her bleeding sons. He realized in that exact moment that the entire Oasis megachurch was nothing but a hollow, toxic scam. He had bought into their holy narrative, but the DNA test and the feral brawl proved they were nothing but common grifters playing dress-up. "There is no misunderstanding, Beatrice. Arthur stated, his voice cutting through the noise of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. I gave this church a $2 million charitable donation last month to fund your new youth center. You have until Monday morning at 9 o'clock to wire every single penny of my money back into my primary business account. If I do not see the full transfer by Monday, I am unleashing my legal team to freeze your remaining personal assets, and I will personally see to it that you are indicted for fraud. Arthur Vance turned on his heel and marched out of the ballroom, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in his wake. Beatrice watched him leave with wild, desperate eyes. The country club staff was already sweeping up the ruined cake and broken glass. But Beatrice knew the real mess was completely unfixable through normal channels. She had mere hours before Arthur Vance unleashed a legal hellfire that would obliterate the Oasis megachurch and completely destroy Marcus' aspiring political career. Beatrice did what she always did when backed into a corner. She decided to ruthlessly sacrifice anyone to save herself and her golden boy. By midnight, the stained glass windows of the megachurch were pitch black, but the executive boardroom on the top floor was blazing with harsh fluorescent light. Beatrice had summoned the 12 governing elders for an emergency mandatory meeting. I knew about the meeting, of course. I still had backdoor access to the church's digital calendar. I stood in the darkened hallway just outside the heavy mahogany doors, listening to Beatrice panic. "We must amputate the infected limbs to save the body of this ministry," Beatrice demanded, her voice echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. She had changed out of her frosting ruined gown and was now wearing a severe black business suit, trying to project absolute authority. "We will draft letters of excommunication tonight. We will publicly expel David, Chloe, and Naomi. We will release a press statement claiming Marcus was the victim of a coordinated malicious spiritual attack orchestrated by his brother and a jealous ex-wife. We cut them loose, and we protect Marcus at all costs." Normally, the board of elders would immediately nod in unison. They were a collection of wealthy local businessmen who enjoyed the tax shelters and social prestige that came with serving on the Oasis board. They always bowed to Beatrice. Tonight, however, the room was completely silent. Beatrice slammed her hand against the polished conference table. "Did you hear me?" she snapped. "I need the expulsion documents drafted immediately. Harrison, call the legal team." Harrison, the chairman of the board, did not reach for his phone. He sat heavily in his leather chair, staring down at his folded hands. He looked physically ill. I decided it was the perfect time to make my entrance. I pushed open the double mahogany doors and stepped into the boardroom. My crimson suit was still perfectly crisp. I carried a sleek leather briefcase and a quiet, unwavering smile. Beatrice whipped her head around, her eyes widening in absolute fury. "What are you doing in here?" she shrieked. "You are no longer authorized to be in this building. Harrison, call security immediately." "Nobody is calling security." "Beatrice," I said, walking calmly toward the head of the table. "And nobody is drafting excommunication letters to protect Marcus." She let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You have lost your mind, Naomi. You think because you caused a scene at a country club you have any power here. This is my church. These men answer to me." I placed my briefcase on the table and snapped the brass locks open. I pulled out 12 distinct, neatly bound financial dossiers and slid them down the polished wood. One dossier stopped perfectly in front of each board member. "They do not answer to you, Beatrice," I stated, my voice dropping to a cold, authoritative register. "They answer to their creditors." Beatrice frowned, looking around the room. What is she talking about, Harrison? Harrison slowly opened his dossier. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "You spent the last 48 hours dealing with federal agents, frozen bank accounts, and a viral country club brawl," I explained, pacing slowly around the table. "While you were distracted, my father Elias was busy doing what he does best. You all thought my father was just a wealthy mechanic who liked old cars. You fundamentally underestimated how much liquid capital it takes to run a global classic car restoration empire." I stopped behind Harrison's chair. "My father hates bullies, Beatrice. And he absolutely despises people who use religion to steal from the vulnerable. So while you were busy trying to save Marcus, my father leveraged his contingency funds and quietly bought up the commercial debt of every single business represented in this room." Beatrice staggered backward, bumping into the whiteboard. "That is impossible," she whispered. "It is just business," I replied smoothly. "Harrison here runs a massive logistics company that was heavily leveraged with a high-interest bridge loan. Elder Miller owns 3 commercial strip malls that were 90 days away from foreclosure. Elder Davis has a manufacturing plant swimming in supply chain debt. My father established a holding company on Friday afternoon and bought every single one of those commercial notes." I looked directly into Beatrice's horrified eyes. "My father effectively owns their businesses, Beatrice. If these men vote to protect Marcus tonight, my father will call in their loans tomorrow morning and bankrupt every single one of them by noon." The 12 powerful men sat in absolute terrified silence. They were completely checkmated, and they knew it. Beatrice's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. She lunged forward, slamming both hands onto the table. "I am the First Lady of this church!" Beatrice screamed, her voice tearing through the room. "I built this ministry from the ground up." Harrison slowly closed his dossier and looked up at her with dead, defeated eyes. "And Elias is the landlord," Harrison replied, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are officially suspended, Beatrice, effective immediately pending a full federal investigation." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. She stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of her chair before she collapsed into it. The matriarch of the Oasis megachurch had been completely dethroned in her own boardroom. I snapped my briefcase shut, turned my back on the entire ruined governing body, and walked out into the cool night air. While Beatrice was losing her empire, Marcus was frantically realizing the walls had completely closed in. He was sitting alone in his sprawling, darkened pastoral office, staring at his frozen bank accounts on his laptop screen. Arthur Vance was demanding $2 million by Monday. The federal agents were building a wire fraud case. His mother was suspended. His brother wanted to kill him. His pregnant mistress was carrying his brother's child. Marcus knew the end had arrived. He made a desperate, panicked decision. He grabbed a black duffel bag from his closet and rushed to the hidden wall safe behind his bookshelf. He punched in the code, his hands shaking violently. Inside were the last remaining untraceable funds he possessed, the cash reserves from his upcoming political campaign. He began shoving stacks of $100 bills into the duffel bag, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. He was going to abandon his family, abandon his church, and flee the city before the sun came up. He zipped the heavy black canvas shut, pulling the strap over his shoulder. The cash would get him across the border, but it would not sustain the lavish lifestyle he demanded. For that, he needed his Cayman accounts. The same accounts my federal audit had locked down tight. He knew he could not simply disappear and start over with pocket change. He needed his millions. He needed his leverage. He needed me. I was walking across the dimly lit asphalt of my father's auto shop parking lot. The crisp night air felt fantastic after the suffocating tension of the church boardroom. I jingled my keys, relishing the quiet victory of watching Beatrice lose her empire. I reached for my car door handle when a shadow suddenly detached itself from the side of the brick building. "Hello, Naomi," Marcus said, his voice trembling with a frantic, dangerous edge. I turned around slowly. The golden boy of Oasis megachurch looked absolutely unrecognizable. His custom ivory suit was stained with pink icing and dried blood from his brawl with David. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were wide and manic, darting around the empty parking lot. He gripped a heavy black duffel bag tightly against his chest. "You look terrible, Marcus," I stated, leaning casually against the door of my car. "I hear Arthur Vance wants his $2 million back. I guess the youth center will have to wait," he sneered, taking a threatening step forward. "Cut the smart attitude, Naomi. You ruined my life. You ruined my family. You took everything from me. Now you are going to fix it." "Fix it?" I laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You slept with your brother's girlfriend. You stole from your congregation. You built an empire on lies. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the cockroaches scatter." Marcus dropped his duffel bag onto the asphalt. He reached into his ruined jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He did not look defeated anymore. He looked vicious. "I am leaving tonight," he demanded, thrusting the envelope toward my face. But I am not leaving empty-handed. You are going to open your laptop right now. You are going to log into the federal audit portal, and you are going to authorize the release of my offshore accounts. You are going to unfreeze my Cayman assets, or I am going to destroy you. I crossed my arms, refusing to take the envelope. With what, exactly? You have no power left, Marcus. He ripped the envelope open and pulled out a stack of glossy printed photographs. He shoved them into my line of sight under the harsh glare of the parking lot street lamp. Take a good look, Naomi. He threatened, a sickeningly smug smile creeping back onto his bruised face. I looked down at the images. They were highly compromising, explicit photographs. The woman in the photos was engaged in deeply degrading acts, and the face looking back at the camera was undeniably mine. Every freckle, every feature matched perfectly. But I knew immediately that I had never been in that hotel room. I had never worn that lingerie. They are called deep fakes, Marcus explained, his voice dripping with malice. I paid a very talented dark web specialist $10,000 to map your face onto a professional actress. The technology is flawless. The lighting, the shadows, the expressions. Nobody will ever be able to tell they are fake. He took another step forward, trapping me against my car door. If you do not unfreeze my accounts right now, I am hitting send on a mass email, he hissed. I am sending these photos to every single one of your corporate accounting clients. I am sending them to your father's business partners. I am sending them to the local news stations and the church board. Your pristine professional reputation will be completely obliterated by morning. You will be a laughingstock. You will never work in this state again. Now, open your laptop. He expected me to panic. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for my reputation just like the old Naomi would have done. He expected the quiet, obedient pastor's wife to surrender. I looked at the disgusting, doctored photographs. Then I looked up into his manic, desperate eyes. I did not flinch. I did not move. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. You still think like a boy, Marcus? I said, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal whisper. His smug smile faltered. What did you just say? You still think like a frightened little boy trying to win a schoolyard fight with cheap theatrical tricks? I replied, shaking my head in genuine pity. You think a few fake pictures frighten me? You think threatening my reputation compares to the federal crimes you have committed? You are so busy playing checkers while I have been playing chess for the last 6 months. I slowly reached up and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my silk blouse. Marcus frowned, stepping back slightly. What are you doing? I pulled aside the fabric of my collar, revealing a small black square microphone taped securely to my collarbone. A thin wire trailed down beneath my clothing, connecting to a transmitter hidden in my waistband. Marcus stared at the wire. The color drained from his face so rapidly, he looked like a ghost under the street lamp. I have not just been auditing your church accounts, Marcus, I explained cheerfully. I have been acting as a forensic financial consultant for the state. Every single altered ledger, every fake charity receipt, every embezzled donation dollar you hid in those Cayman accounts has been fed directly to District Attorney Reynolds. He has been building a massive racketeering and wire fraud case against you and Beatrice under the RICO Act. Marcus began to shake violently. The glossy, deep-fake photos slipped from his trembling hands and scattered across the dirty asphalt. And the best part, I continued tapping the small black microphone on my chest, is that this wire is currently broadcasting a live audio feed directly to a federal surveillance van parked less than 2 blocks away. Marcus choked out a breathless, panicked sound. You did not just threaten your ex-wife in a parking lot, Marcus. I stated, my voice ringing with finality. You just committed felony extortion and blackmail against a cooperating federal witness. You just confessed to hiring dark web specialists to create fraudulent materials in a desperate attempt to access frozen criminal assets. And you did it all on a crystal-clear federal recording. Marcus looked down at the scattered photos. He looked at the wire taped to my chest. He looked at the black duffel bag of stolen campaign cash sitting by his feet. The absolute gravity of his colossal mistake crashed down upon him. He had just handed the district attorney the final nail for his own coffin. He let out a terrified, guttural cry. He did not even grab the duffel bag. He abandoned his cash, abandoned his threats, and sprinted blindly into the darkness of the surrounding alleyways, running for his life. as the distant wail of approaching police sirens began to pierce the quiet night air. Marcus' footsteps faded into the wail of sirens. I stood perfectly still by my car and watched the flashing red and blue lights swarm the perimeter of the auto shop, blocking every possible escape route. The federal agents had him completely boxed in before he even reached the end of the block. Two unmarked black SUVs screeched to a halt at the alley entrance, and I watched as armed officers swarmed the shadows. A few moments later, they dragged Marcus out into the harsh streetlights, his wrists securely bound in heavy steel handcuffs. He was sobbing loudly, his arrogant golden boy facade entirely shattered. I reached up, pressed my fingers against the small transmitter hidden beneath my blouse, and felt the steady, reassuring hum of justice finally being served. I turned around and walked back into the warm safety of my father's shop. 3 months later, the city was buried under a brutal, punishing blizzard. The wind howled against the reinforced steel doors of Elias' auto shop, rattling the heavy glass panes with relentless force. I sat comfortably in the elevated manager's office, sipping a mug of hot coffee, while reviewing the latest client portfolios for my newly launched forensic accounting firm. Zuri was fast asleep on a plush rug near the space heater, completely safe and warm. My life was finally my own. The Sterling family empire, however, was nothing but a smoking crater. The federal indictments had swept through their ranks like a scythe. Marcus was sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting trial for racketeering and wire fraud. Beatrice was under house arrest, her assets completely frozen, and her pristine reputation destroyed. But nobody had fallen harder or faster than Eleanor. The false Child Protective Services report she had filed against me was a severe felony. Once the investigators pulled the security footage and phone records, her entire life unraveled. Her wealthy husband immediately filed for divorce, cutting off her access to his bank accounts and evicting her from their sprawling suburban estate. The country club stripped her of her membership. Her high society friends stopped answering her calls. Eleanor was suddenly facing bankruptcy, imminent jail time, and absolute social exile. She had nothing left. A loud, frantic pounding echoed from the lower garage bay. I looked up from my laptop. The digital clock on my desk read 10:15 at night. The shop was closed, and the blizzard outside was dropping temperatures well below freezing. The pounding continued, desperate and unyielding. I walked down the metal stairs and crossed the dark garage floor. I flipped the security monitor switch and looked at the external camera feed. A solitary figure was huddled against the side door, shivering violently under the harsh yellow security light. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the steel door open. A violent gust of snow blew into the garage, bringing Eleanor with it. She stumbled across the threshold and collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. The sight of her was jarring. The impeccably styled, arrogant socialite was gone. Her designer coat was soaked through and plastered to her shivering frame. Her blonde hair was a tangled, matted mess of ice and snow. Her lips were blue, and she was shaking so hard she could barely support her own weight. It was a perfect, haunting mirror image of the night she and Marcus had thrown me and my infant daughter out into the freezing rain on Christmas Eve. "Naomi," she gasped, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She scrambled to her knees, wrapping her freezing arms around herself. "Please do not close the door. Please." I stood over her, my arms crossed, my expression entirely neutral. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I simply observed the reality of consequences. "What are you doing here, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice echoing flatly against the high ceiling of the garage. "I have nowhere else to go," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "The banks took my cards. My husband locked me out. The church board will not even look at me. I have been walking in the snow for hours." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot tears cutting warm tracks through the freezing snow on her cheeks. These were not her usual manipulative theatrical tears. This was raw, unadulterated desperation. She reached a shaking hand toward the hem of my trousers. "Naomi, please," she begged, her voice dropping to a pathetic whisper. "We are women. We have to stick together. We were both manipulated by these terrible men. Marcus and David and the board, they used us. They pitted us against each other. Please." You know what it is like to be out in the cold. You know what it is like to lose everything. Help me. Show me some mercy." I looked down at her outstretched hand. I did not move an inch. The sheer audacity of her plea, the calculated attempt to weaponize female solidarity after everything she had done, was staggering. I looked her dead in the eyes with absolute ice. "You poured cold water on my 1-year-old daughter in a blizzard." I stated, my voice deadly, calm, and razor-sharp. "You stood on that porch and laughed while my baby screamed in the freezing rain. You filed a fabricated federal report to have my child stripped from my arms. You do not get sisterhood, Eleanor. And you certainly do not get to play the victim." She flinched, pulling her hand back as if I had burned her. "But I am freezing," she cried, curling into a tight ball on the concrete. "I have nothing." I turned away from her and walked over to the utility closet in the corner of the garage. I opened the door and reached inside, grasping the wooden handle of a heavy industrial mop. I walked back and tossed it onto the concrete. The wooden handle clattered loudly, stopping right at Eleanor's freezing hands. "We need a janitor," I said, staring down at her ruined designer clothes. "Minimum wage. You will scrub the oil stains, clean the bathrooms, and empty the trash bins. Take it or freeze." Eleanor stared at this dirty mop head, her face twisting in absolute horror. "You cannot be serious," she choked out. "I am a Sterling. I am a board member. I cannot scrub floors." "You are a bankrupt felon with no shelter," I corrected her, my voice ringing with total authority. "Take the mop or step back out into the freezing snow. Those are your only two options." Eleanor looked at the heavy steel door behind her. She listened to the brutal howling wind of the blizzard raging outside. She looked back at me and then down at the mop. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Her precious white privilege, her untouchable social status, her wealthy armor, it had all completely evaporated. She was utterly powerless, standing in the shadow of my financial and legal dominance. She let out a loud, broken sob. Her shoulders slumped forward in complete and total defeat. Slowly, with trembling, freezing hands, Eleanor reached out and grabbed the wooden handle of the mop. She pulled it toward her chest, weeping bitterly into the dirty bristles as the harsh reality of her new life finally settled in. The winter dragged on, and the federal indictments wrapped around the Sterling family like a suffocating iron net. Yet a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. Beatrice and Marcus were currently out on exorbitant federal bail bonds, facing a mountain of racketeering, extortion, and fraud charges. Their assets were heavily monitored, and their legal bills were astronomical. They needed cash immediately. So Beatrice orchestrated the only maneuver she knew. She fell back on the grift. It was New Year's Eve, the night of the annual watch night service. Despite her official suspension from the board, Beatrice had ruthlessly strong-armed her way back into the building for one final spectacular event. She understood that a fraction of their congregation remained blindly loyal. These were the people who willingly ignored the viral country club brawl, the federal raids, and the damning news reports. They were deeply, thoroughly brainwashed, and Beatrice fully intended to wring every last dime out of them before the prison doors slammed shut. She marketed the midnight service as a desperate plea against spiritual warfare. She sent out dramatic, urgent newsletters claiming the Sterling family was being unjustly persecuted by dark demonic forces and vindictive enemies. It was a masterful final performance designed purely to manufacture sympathy and generate a massive tax-free cash offering. The sanctuary of Oasis Megachurch was packed to the brim. Thousands of loyalists filled the plush velvet seats, their faces turned upward toward the massive digital screens flanking the altar. The atmosphere was thick with manufactured grief and heavy organ music. Marcus stood at the grand acrylic pulpit. He looked like a shell of the golden boy who used to command this room with effortless charm. His bespoke suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and a thick layer of sweat coated his forehead under the harsh stage lights. The heavy federal ankle monitor strapped to his leg was carefully hidden beneath his tailored trousers. He gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles turning white as he leaned into the microphone. "The enemy comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy." Marcus preached, his voice trembling with practiced theatrical emotion. The devil uses the people we trust the most to tear down God's anointed. We have been attacked. My family has been slandered. We have been dragged through the mud by those consumed with bitterness and jealousy. But tonight we stand before you asking for your grace. Beatrice sat in the very front row, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, nodding along in exaggerated pious agreement. Forgiveness is the hardest path. Marcus continued, his voice breaking as he squeezed his eyes shut, forcing a single tear to roll down his cheek. I have forgiven those who seek to destroy my life. I have forgiven the lies, the betrayals, the legal attacks. And I ask you, my faithful flock, to stand with me in this spiritual warfare. We need a special restoration offering tonight to keep these doors open to fight the darkness. The congregation murmured in sympathetic agreement. Ushers stood at the ready, holding large velvet offering buckets, preparing to collect the legal defense fund masked as a tithe. The organist began to play a soft, swelling chord to prime the crowd for maximum generosity. It was 10 minutes to midnight. I did not let him finish his plea. At the back of the massive sanctuary, the colossal, heavy oak doors suddenly groaned open. The sound was incredibly loud, cutting straight through the soft organ music and echoing across the cavernous room. The entire congregation turned in their seats, irritated by the interruption. I stepped over the threshold, and the irritation instantly dissolved into absolute stunned silence. I was not wearing the modest pastel dresses of a submissive pastor's wife. I was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored, floor-length crimson gown that demanded absolute authority. The deep red silk draped perfectly over my frame, a visual declaration of power and survival. My hair was styled in sleek dark waves, and my makeup was sharp and flawless. I did not look like the bitter, jealous ex-wife Marcus was just crying about. I looked like a queen stepping into a conquered territory. I was not alone. I walked arm in arm with my father Elias. He wore a sharp black suit, his broad shoulders squared and his silver hair perfectly combed. He exuded the quiet, dangerous power of a man who held the entire fate of this room in his hands. He was no longer just the auto shop mechanic. He was the landlord, the debt holder, and the executioner of the Oasis board. The organist completely froze. His hands slipped from the keys, leaving a jarring, dissonant chord hanging in the air. The silence that fell over the megachurch was so profound you could hear the soft, rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor of the center aisle. Thousands of eyes tracked our movement. The loyalists recognized me instantly. They stared in slack-jawed shock, unable to comprehend how the woman their pastor was just demonizing had the sheer audacity to walk through the front doors. Beatrice whipped her head around. Her jaw dropped open and the lace handkerchief slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the carpet. The manufactured piety completely vanished from her face, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. Marcus stood frozen behind the acrylic pulpit. His mouth hung open. The microphone picked up his ragged, shaky breathing, broadcasting his sudden panic through the massive sound system. He stared at me, his eyes wide and frantic, darting from my face to the heavy oak doors behind me, as if expecting federal agents to march down the aisle. Elias and I did not rush. We walked with slow, deliberate precision down the long center aisle, perfectly synchronized. We ignored the gasps and the frantic whispering erupting through the pews. We kept our eyes locked entirely on the stage. We stopped exactly at the front row, right beside Beatrice. I looked up at Marcus. I offered him a cold, terrifyingly serene smile. The golden boy of Oasis megachurch was sweating profusely, gripping the pulpit like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. The trap was set, and the entire congregation was about to watch the final execution. Beatrice was the first to break the paralyzing silence. She scrambled out of her plush velvet seat, her face flushed a blotchy, furious red. She pointed a trembling finger at me, and then swept her arm toward the back of the sanctuary. "Remove these people immediately!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "They are trespassing. Davis, get your team out here and throw them onto the street. Call the police, call everyone." 4 burly security guards in dark suits stood at the edge of the center aisle. They were men Beatrice had personally hired to intimidate the congregation and enforce her absolute will. But tonight, they did not move a single muscle. Davis, the head of security, simply looked at my father. Elias tipped his head a fraction of an inch. Davis crossed his arms over his chest and planted his feet firmly into the carpet. Beatrice whirled around, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief. "Davis, I pay your salary!" she shrieked. "I command you to remove them right now." Davis did not even blink. "Actually, ma'am, you do not pay my salary," he replied, his voice echoing clearly across the quiet church. "Mr. Sterling pays my salary, and Mr. Sterling instructed us to stand down." Beatrice looked like she had been physically struck by a heavy stone. She stumbled back against the wooden pew, clutching her chest, as her perceived power completely evaporated. Elias gently released my arm. He stepped past Beatrice as if she were nothing but an invisible draft of air. He ascended the carpeted stairs to the massive stage with heavy measured steps. Marcus shrank back, gripping the acrylic pulpit. He tried to cover the microphone, but Elias simply reached out and placed a large, calloused hand on Marcus' shoulder. The sheer physical presence and quiet menace of my father forced Marcus to stumble backward, abandoning the pulpit entirely. Elias stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted it with a sharp metallic screech that made the congregation flinch. He looked down at Beatrice, who was hyperventilating in the front row, and then out at the thousands of loyalists clutching their offering envelopes. "Beatrice Elias," began, his deep voice booming off the vaulted ceilings, "you have spent the last hour begging these good people for their hard-earned money. You claim you are fighting spiritual warfare. You claim you are the victim of demonic persecution. But you and I both know the only thing you are fighting tonight is the devastating consequence of your own boundless greed." "That is a lie," Beatrice shouted, pointing wildly at the crowd. "Do not listen to him. He is just a mechanic. He is a nobody trying to steal our glory." Elias let out a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills through the cavernous room. 15 years ago, this very ministry was completely bankrupt, Elias stated, staring a hole straight through Beatrice. "You and your late husband overleveraged this church to fund your private jets, your luxury vehicles, and your lavish suburban mansions. The banks were 72 hours away from chaining these oak doors shut and liquidating the entire property. You were entirely ruined." The congregation began to murmur. The loyalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking from Elias to Beatrice. Beatrice frantically shook her head, but no sound came out of her mouth. "An anonymous holding company stepped in at the 11th hour, paid off your massive commercial debt, and bought the deed to this property." Elias continued, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "That anonymous holding company was me, Beatrice. I bought the ground you are standing on. I own the roof over your head. I hold the commercial deed to this entire building. And as of this exact moment, you and your corrupt son are trespassing on my private property." The sanctuary erupted into total chaos. Thousands of people gasped, shouting questions and staring at the stage in pure shock. Elias held up one hand, and the sheer commanding force of his gesture silenced the room almost instantly. "I let you operate here rent-free for 15 years, Beatrice," Elias explained, leaning closer to the microphone. "I did it because I believed this community needed a sanctuary. I did it because my daughter, Naomi, asked me to see the good in this ministry. I established a blind trust with a very strict stipulation. If the governing board ever engaged in criminal fraud, or if my daughter was ever mistreated, the grace period would terminate immediately without warning." Elias swept his arm toward me. I stood at the bottom of the altar steps, my crimson gown vibrant against the dark wood, my posture unbroken. "You have been funneling your congregation's paychecks into offering buckets to fund a lifestyle of absolute corruption," Elias declared, his voice rising in righteous fury. "You and Marcus hid their hard-earned donations in offshore Cayman accounts. You threw my daughter out into a blizzard on Christmas Eve. You orchestrated a fake federal report to steal her infant child. You threatened her life. The grace period is officially over. I am foreclosing on this property tonight. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your belongings and vacate my building." Beatrice collapsed back into her seat, covering her face with her trembling hands. The matriarch of Oasis Megachurch had just been publicly evicted in front of her entire adoring flock. But Marcus was not ready to surrender. With sheer panic overriding his common sense, he rushed forward, grabbing a secondary microphone from the stage stand. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically across the sea of shocked faces. "Lies," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with high-pitched hysteria. "Do not listen to him. This is an attack from the enemy. He is trying to steal our spiritual home. He is trying to break our faith." Marcus glared down at Elias and then locked his furious, manic eyes on me. "You cannot foreclose on us," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You cannot evict a church of this magnitude. We are an unstoppable force. We have over $4 million sitting in the sanctuary building fund right this second. We will just buy the deed from you outright. We do not need your fake charity, Elias. We are financially secure. We will purchase this building tonight and expel these agents of darkness forever." Marcus turned back to the crowd, throwing his hands in the air, trying desperately to rally them back under his spell. "We will not be defeated," he yelled. I slowly walked up the first 2 steps of the altar. I looked at Marcus' desperate, sweating face. I let out a soft, chilling laugh that carried perfectly through the silent spaces between his frantic shouts. I turned my gaze past the altar, past the thousands of staring faces, and looked directly up at the glass-enclosed audio-visual booth perched high in the balcony. I gave a sharp, clear nod to the technician waiting behind the glass. The moment my chin dipped, the sanctuary plunged into complete darkness. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous room. Then the twin massive projector screens flanking the altar flared to life, bathing the terrified faces of the Sterling family in a harsh, clinical white light. These screens were usually reserved for displaying sanitized Bible verses and lyrics to uplifting worship songs. Tonight they displayed the cold, undeniable truth. High-resolution images of offshore bank statements, shell company registrations, and heavily redacted tax returns flashed across the screens. At the very center of the display was a massive interconnected web of financial transactions, all leading directly back to the Oasis megachurch operating accounts. I stepped up to the acrylic pulpit, pushing Marcus aside. I did not need to raise my voice. The microphone caught every crisp syllable. "You asked for a restoration offering tonight, Marcus?" I said, projecting my voice over the silent, stunned crowd. "You claimed you were the victim of spiritual warfare. So let us look at exactly what kind of warfare you have been funding." I clicked a small remote in my hand. The screen zoomed in on a specific ledger. A bright red highlight illuminated a series of recurring wire transfers. "Let us start with the future state senator," I announced. "Marcus, you have been quietly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars from your supposedly clean political campaign fund directly into a private real estate trust. That trust owns a luxury downtown penthouse. The sole resident of that penthouse is Chloe, your brother's pregnant girlfriend, the woman carrying your child." The sanctuary erupted into a cacophony of shocked murmurs. In the third row, Chloe buried her face in her hands. Beside her, David bolted upright, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure betrayal and rage as he glared at his brother. "But we cannot forget about David," I continued, clicking the remote again. The screen shifted to a new document. This one bore the official seal of the Oasis Youth Ministry. "David, you have been managing the youth outreach program for 3 years. You claim the funds were being used to build community centers and host summer camps. But the federal audit shows that over $400,000 was systematically drained from that account and wired directly to offshore gambling syndicates to cover your massive sports betting debts. You literally stole from children to pay off bookies." The murmurs in the crowd escalated into angry shouts. People were standing up in their pews, pointing at the stage. "And finally, we have the matriarch," I said, turning my gaze down to Beatrice, who was shrinking into her front row seat, looking physically ill. The screen shifted one last time, displaying a web of vehicle registration documents and corporate tax filings. "Beatrice, you built this empire on the backs of hardworking people who trusted you. You demanded 10% of their income while you lived entirely tax-free. You leased a fleet of 6 luxury vehicles, including the heavily armored SUV you arrived in tonight, completely under the church's tax-exempt religious status. You claimed they were necessary ministry vehicles. You used the offering buckets to fund a lifestyle of absolute unchecked greed. The evidence was irrefutable. The congregation was staring at the exact routing numbers, the dates, the forged signatures. The spell was completely broken. The collapse was instantaneous and violent. The remaining loyalists who had been ready to empty their bank accounts for Marcus just minutes prior erupted into absolute fury. A tidal wave of betrayal crashed through the sanctuary. People began screaming, demanding their tithes back. Ushers dropped the velvet offering buckets, spilling cash and checks across the aisles. The pristine, highly controlled environment of the megachurch descended into a riot. In the front row, Chloe's father, a prominent local businessman who had donated heavily to Marcus' campaigns, suddenly stood up. His face was purple with rage. He lunged over the wooden pew and grabbed Marcus by the collar of his expensive, bespoke suit. "You hypocrite!" he roared, shaking Marcus violently. "You slept with my daughter. You stole my money. You are a disgusting fraud." Security guards rushed forward, but the crowd blocked their path. The congregation was turning on the Sterlings, tearing down the very idol they had worshipped for over a decade. Beatrice was screaming for someone to help her, swatting blindly at former friends who were now demanding answers. David was trying to push his way through the crowd, attempting to flee the building before the mob completely overtook them. Elias stood calmly by the altar steps, watching the empire crumble to dust. He looked at me and offered a single approving nod. The landlord had delivered his eviction notice, and the tenants were tearing themselves apart. Marcus managed to shove Chloe's father away, stumbling backward against the acrylic pulpit. His eyes were wide with pure terror. He looked at the screaming crowd, the damning evidence on the screens, and finally at me. "You cannot do this," he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "We have millions in the building fund. We will buy you out. We will pay whatever you want, Naomi. Just turn the screens off." I smiled, a calm, terrifyingly serene smile. "You do not have a building fund, Marcus," I replied smoothly. "The federal government froze every single one of your accounts at 8 o'clock this morning. You are completely bankrupt." Before Marcus could process the finality of those words, a massive booming crash echoed from the rear of the sanctuary. The heavy oak doors were violently thrown open, hitting the walls with a deafening crack. The angry shouts of the congregation instantly died down, replaced by sharp gasps of shock. Dozens of federal agents swarmed into the church. They wore heavy tactical gear with FBI and IRS emblazoned in bright yellow letters across their tactical vests. They moved with terrifying precision, fanning out across the aisles and securing every exit. "FBI, nobody move!" "A senior agent," bellowed his voice, carrying absolute authority. The congregation scrambled out of the way, parting like the Red Sea as the tactical team marched straight down the center aisle toward the stage. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek, attempting to run toward the side exit. But two IRS agents intercepted her immediately, forcing her arms behind her back and securing her wrists with heavy zip ties. She sobbed wildly, her pristine image completely shattered as they read her rights. David did not even make it out of the pew. He was tackled to the carpet by three agents, his face pressed into the ground, where the offering envelopes had spilled. Marcus stood frozen behind the pulpit. The golden boy of Oasis Mega Church was trembling so violently he could barely stand. He looked completely broken, a terrified child trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Two senior FBI agents marched up the altar steps. They bypassed me completely, keeping their eyes locked on Marcus. "Marcus Sterling," one agent stated, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, racketeering, extortion, and tax evasion. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Marcus slowly turned around. The harsh click of the handcuffs echoing loudly through the silent sanctuary was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The forensic annihilation was complete. The federal agents moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency. They hauled David off the carpet, his face bruised and smeared with gray dust from the floorboards. He kicked and thrashed like a wild animal, screaming at the top of his lungs that he had nothing to do with the offshore accounts. He yelled that his mother and brother were the real masterminds, that they had forced him to sign those youth ministry ledgers. There was absolutely no honor among thieves. Watching David instantly sell out his own flesh and blood to save his own skin was the ultimate proof of their profound moral bankruptcy. Beatrice fought the hardest. She twisted violently against the heavy plastic zip ties, digging her expensive designer heels into the marble floor and scratching at the tactical vests of the officers. Her immaculate hair was tangled and wild. Her heavy makeup ran in dark, ugly streaks down her face, completely destroying her carefully cultivated appearance. For decades, she had ruled the city through respectability politics, hiding behind a veneer of pastel modesty and righteous piety. Now she was being walked through the center aisle of her own conquered kingdom, a common criminal exposed for the entire world to see. Congregants raised their smartphones, recording every humiliating second of her spectacular downfall. The woman who had demanded absolute submission from everyone around her was reduced to a sobbing, hysterical mess, begging for mercy from a crowd that only looked back at her with sheer disgust. Marcus was a different story entirely. The fight had completely drained out of him the moment the steel clamped around his wrists. He looked hollowed out, his broad shoulders slumped forward as the agents jerked him toward the altar stairs. The massive projector screens behind the pulpit were still glowing brightly, illuminating his pale, sweating face with the undeniable evidence of his monumental fraud. But right as they reached the bottom step, his eyes locked onto mine. Something primal and desperate snapped inside him. He threw his weight against the two imposing agents, holding his arms, forcing them to halt for a fraction of a second. He dropped his knees heavily onto the carpet, ignoring the sharp commands of the federal officers trying to pull him back up. "Naomi, wait." Marcus begged, his voice ragged and wet with tears. "Please, you have to stop this. You have the money. You and Elias can make this go away. Tell them it is a misunderstanding." I stared down at him from the top of the altar stairs. I did not say a single word. I simply watched the golden boy grovel in the dirt. "We are family, Naomi." Marquis sobbed, straining against the cuffs, cutting deeply into his wrists. "We share blood. You cannot do this to me. Think of our daughter. Think of Zuri. You cannot let her father go to federal prison. She needs me. She needs her dad." The absolute audacity of his plea hung heavy in the cold air. This was the man who had thrown me out into a freezing blizzard on Christmas Eve without a second thought. This was the man who had actively conspired to steal my infant child, using fabricated court documents and bribed judges. This was the man who had never once thought of Zuri as anything more than a convenient pawn to secure his own public legacy. And now, cornered and utterly defeated, he was trying to use my love for our child as a human shield. I walked slowly down the final 2 steps, closing the distance between us. The federal agents paused, recognizing the heavy gravity of the moment, allowing me exactly 5 seconds of uninterrupted closure. I looked down at Marcus Sterling. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. My heart was perfectly still, entirely devoid of the toxic sympathy his family had mercilessly exploited for 30 years. "I am thinking of Zuri," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and echoing with absolute finality. "That is why I am taking out the trash." Marcus' face crumpled into a mask of pure despair. He let out a pathetic guttural wail as the agents hoisted him upward, dragging him roughly toward the heavy oak doors. He thrashed and screamed my name over and over again, but I turned my back to him. I did not watch him leave. The massive sanctuary was slowly emptying as congregants filed out behind the authorities, their illusions completely shattered and their pockets tightly guarded. Elias walked up beside me. He placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. His silent presence was a mountain of unwavering support. "It is done," my father said, his deep voice a soothing rumble against the residual chaos of the room. "Let us go home." I nodded. We walked together down the side aisle, bypassing the frantic crowds and the scattered offering envelopes that littered the floor like fallen autumn leaves. We exited through the private pastoral doors and stepped out into the night. The crisp, midnight air of the new year hit my face like a refreshing wave of pure oxygen. It was bracing and immaculately clean. In the main parking lot, a dozen federal vehicles sat with their red and blue lights spinning frantically, casting harsh, jagged shadows against the massive stained glass windows of Oasis megachurch. Reporters and news vans were already swarming the iron gates, capturing the spectacular collapse of the Sterling Empire for the morning broadcasts. I did not look back at the flashing police lights. I did not look back at the sprawling building that had once been my prison. That chapter of my life was permanently sealed shut. Elias and I rode back to the city center in a comfortable, quiet silence. The streets were alive with people celebrating the new year, completely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had just occurred on the outskirts of town. The fireworks bursting overhead seemed like a personal celebration of my victory. When I finally stepped into the quiet foyer of my luxury penthouse, the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the rest of the world. The soft ambient lighting illuminated the sleek modern lines of my home. I walked straight past the expansive living room and pushed open the door to the nursery. Zuri was fast asleep in her crib. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. She was safe. She was secure. She would never know the sting of Beatrice's vicious manipulation or the crushing weight of Marcus's narcissistic abuse. She would grow up surrounded by truth, stability, and unconditional love. I leaned over the crib and pressed a soft, warm kiss against her forehead. I left the nursery door slightly ajar and walked out onto the expansive glass balcony. The cold wind whipped through my dark hair as I gripped the metal railing. The city skyline stretched out before me, a glittering sea of lights and endless possibilities. For my entire life, I had been the designated scapegoat. I had been the punching bag, the afterthought, the disposable daughter, forced to shrink herself so the Sterling family could falsely shine. They had tried to break me. They had tried to bury me beneath a mountain of lies and deceit. Instead, they had unknowingly given me the exact tools I needed to conquer them. I looked out over the sprawling metropolis that I now effectively owned. The multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, the thriving corporate acquisitions, the unshakable bond with my father, and the absolute destruction of my abusers were all beautiful testaments to my survival. I took a deep breath of the freezing winter air, tasting the sweet, intoxicating flavor of true power and absolute freedom. The revenge was finally complete, and the future belonged entirely to me. The story of Naomi's triumph teaches us that true power does not lie in manipulation, performative respectability, or stolen wealth. It lies in standing firmly in your truth and refusing to be a victim to toxic family dynamics. The Sterling family built their empire on deceit, ruthlessly exploiting the vulnerable to maintain a pristine facade. Ultimately, their boundless greed engineered their own spectacular downfall. Healing begins when we reclaim our boundaries, expose the gaslighting, and prioritize authentic love over performative obligation. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic environment? Share your powerful survival journey safely below.